Europe is in disarray as the prospect of a full-scale war on the continent becomes more and more likely. While other nations are panicking, one has taken the opportunity to arm up and ensure its sovereignty cannot be challenged by the looming Russian bear in the east. Let's look at this surprising dark horse in the current European arms race and how history is shaping its ongoing rapid militarization. On the first day of World War II, the German army surged across the borders of Poland with a blitzkrieg of infantry and armored cars. From the north, south, and west, the invaders came, aided by Slovak forces and its temporary ally, the Soviet Union. The Polish government was not prepared for the onslaught that was about to ravage their nation. There was no chance to negotiate with the Germans, who had made up their mind, so Poland quickly rallied its available defenses. In one skirmish, German infantry were caught off guard by a cavalry charge led by Colonel Kazimierz Masztalesz. Even with the advantage of modern firearms, the Germans couldn't fend off an entire Polish squadron on horseback. The invading infantry was forced to disperse, but before the cavalry could celebrate this minor victory, machine gun fire ripped through the air toward the riders and their horses. Alongside German reconnaissance vehicles, modern German tactics and technology decimated the Polish troops. Colonel Masztalesz was killed in the ensuing fire, as well as one of his subordinate officers, and the rest of the cavalry was forced to gallop to cover. The historic battle between the Polish cavalrymen and German heavy artillery came to be known as the Charge at Kroyanta, and it's lived on as an exaggerated myth in a number of propaganda campaigns. Due to a critical lapse in communication, the events of the day were falsely reported by Italian journalists as having included a direct cavalry charge from the Polish against German tanks. While this interpretation was based on gruesome photographs of the aftermath, the image of riders with lances and swords facing down invaders with far greater military capabilities was embedded in the collective consciousness of the modern world. Nazi Germany used this mythological visualization of the Charge at Kroyanta to boast about how advanced their weaponry was, as well as to imply they had more tanks to utilize against their enemies than they truly did. Soviet propaganda took this a step further, implying that Poland had sent many members of their cavalry to die out of complete ignorance. In the constructed Soviet view of the events, Polish military leadership was reckless and unwilling to modernize their army. This piece of propaganda was taught in many schools up until the 1990s, leading to many people growing up thinking the Polish army was fundamentally weak and unwilling to modernize. Of course, this is just a piece of propaganda. Even in the year 1939, Poland was already developing its own motorized battalions and was implementing anti-tank artillery within its armed forces. Though still considerably less powerful than the great powers at the time, Poland was nowhere near as ignorant of the advances in warfare as either Nazi or Soviet narratives implied. Even so, history is written by the victors, and the myth of the Charge at Kroyanta stuck, especially as Poland struggled to keep up with the rest of its allies during World War II. But times are changing, and Poland's taken it upon itself to disprove this lasting myth. The once downtrodden republic has come a long way from its prior crushing defeats, which ironically might have been the key factor in galvanizing Poland toward efficient self-defense. Poland is quickly becoming Europe's underdog military powerhouse, but before you find out how, you need to find out why. The Charge at Kroyanta was only the beginning of Poland's struggles during the Second World War, as the fighting both within and beyond the borders brought many Poles to the front lines. Domestically, the German occupation was opposed by an expansive resistance network that provided 43% of all reports to British intelligence coming from Central Europe. Abroad, Polish troops were the fourth largest demographic among soldiers across European fronts. Even as an underground state, Poland was already making itself an instrumental part of the Allied war effort. Though liberating Europe from the Nazis was the goal, Poland had a responsibility to itself as well. It resented the possibility that its territory could remain occupied after the war by an opportunistic foreign power. These fears were confirmed when their own government in exile was given no sway over the proceedings at the Yalta Conference. The communist dictator Joseph Stalin made a power grab that forced Poland to capitulate to the whims of the Soviet state. Under the guise of allowing Poland to retain national sovereignty, elections were rigged, and the mechanisms of governance were used deceptively to promote a pro-Soviet and pro-communist policy plan. With the rest of Poland's European allies having effectively turned their back on the occupied nation, the Polish people were stuck contending with Stalin's depression. This sudden betrayal would linger in the minds of future generations to come. Once again, Poland's sense of national identity was resilient in the face of outside authoritarianism. Many of the same resistance organizations that were active during German occupation had grown into political movements that stood in opposition to communist rule. These included the Freedom and Independence Association, as well as the Polish Home Army, or Armia Krajowa. The most powerful force in overcoming communism was the trade unions, which brought about social justice and workers' rights on a level that Stalinist communism was incapable of offering. This united movement of solidarity allowed Poland to take power back into the hands of its people, and with support from the United States as well as the Catholic Church, succeeded in a non-violent revolution that stamped out all remaining elements of communism by the 1990s. Having overcome two different authoritarian regimes that sought to exploit the common people with lofty promises, Poland under Solidarity was, for a brief moment in time, positioned uniquely as a country that could realistically achieve the supposed aims of both fascism and communism without the corruption and deception common in real-life examples of both ideologies. This unique situation would not last, however, as the onset of liberal capitalism throughout the 1990s cooled Poland into becoming less of a radical powder keg. But even while Poland comfortably faded into the background of global politics, there was one value that remained as an overriding principle for its future endeavors. That value is the importance of self-sufficiency. This is how we've arrived at a current moment where Poland has shored up its defenses to the point of eclipsing several of its neighbors in raw firepower, being situated in the center of a region that has for decades been threatened by war. Poland stands to gain a lot by making itself the dominant military force in Eastern Central Europe. In terms of raw personnel, Poland currently has a slightly smaller army than its former adversary, Germany. But Minister of Defense Mariusz Błaszczak has announced plans to swell those numbers to a total of 300,000 by 2035, which would officially put Poland head and shoulders above any mainland European nation army, with the exception of Russia. Poland's growing dominance in the region will likely grow as Germany continues to be reluctant to fully remilitarize in accordance with its own Morgenthau Plan following World War II. Poland's geographical proximity to the Baltic states will also make them the most reliable defender of the vulnerable NATO members. This would put it on almost even footing with France as NATO's primary or secondary European power, eclipsing the once prominent United Kingdom. So what exactly are Poland's plans? And will they really turn a historical underdog into a rising great power? Even without the sheer numbers promised by the new recruitment plan, Poland's land forces are already formidable. Poland possesses a much greater number of tanks and howitzers than most of its neighbors and is on track to have more than Germany, Italy, and France combined. These heavy metal weapons are primarily of American and South Korean make and have the top-notch specs to match. Military trade deals such as these free Poland up from relying on outdated Russian weaponry, which, as can be seen in Russia's catastrophic loss of tanks in Ukraine, have been shown to have some rather severe design flaws. As part of this effort to modernize, Poland has steadily been replacing Russian-made tanks with state-of-the-art M1 Abrams, an American tank that boasts both extreme mobility and highly durable armor. The stunning reputation of the Abrams as a battle tank cannot be understated, and the United States has used this tank to great effect in its own foreign skirmishes. The use of depleted uranium in the armor makes the M1 Abrams highly resistant to both ballistics and explosives, and very few that have been deployed have ever been critically damaged. Among those Abrams tanks that were downed, several were taken out by friendly fire from the anti-tank weaponry of other Abrams units. With a 1,500 horsepower turbine that can maneuver the tank across all manner of difficult terrain, the Abrams is able to run down opposing tanks and destroy them at close range. And with two high-caliber machine guns, in addition to the main cannon, the tank has more than enough firepower to do just that. Compared to a Russian T-72, which is a considerably lighter tank that has a maximum speed of 37 miles per hour, the M1 Abrams can travel 45 miles per hour while still carrying the weight of its heavy armor. The most revolutionary feature of the M1 Abrams by far is its onboard communication systems, which include blue force tracking and infrared sights to enhance visibility and cooperation with friendly units on the battlefield. These tools help with heightened battlefield awareness, making the Abrams a combat vehicle that reaps great rewards when it's piloted by a significantly competent and well-trained four-person team. Apart from the Abrams, Poland's acquired a large supply of K2 Black Panther tanks from South Korea and has announced plans to open a factory that will construct them domestically. Dubbed the most expensive tank in the world, the K2 was developed as a modification of the standard M1 Abrams into a sleeker and smaller battle tank with even greater mobility options. Its ability to ford across medium-depth bodies of water through hydro-pneumatic suspension is unmatched by any armored vehicle in history. Additionally, the K2 Black Panther boasts unique weapon systems that surpass the Abrams in tank-to-tank combat, most notably the Korean Smart Top Attack Munition, or K-STAM, fired by the cannon. The K-STAM is guided through smart munitions technology to seek out the weakest parts of enemy tanks and is a recent innovation of the South Korean military technology. While the overall similarities in appearance to K2 Panthers and M1 Abrams have given it a second nickname, the Baby Abrams, due to its smaller size, taking the South Korean tank lightly would be a grave mistake. The hefty price tag on the 1,000 K2 Black Panthers Poland's purchased is especially daunting, but given that it's the most powerful pound-for-pound tank on the market, the price tag is justified. Poland will be the first nation in both the European Union and NATO to utilize these marvels of South Korean engineering outside of their native country, and by producing them domestically, the Republic might even have the power to develop its own cheaper but comparably effective variation. But there are other strategic purchases that Poland's made to improve both its ground and anti-air capabilities, such as the 500 HIMARS rocket launchers, which were acquired from the US for $10 billion. The HIMARS, or High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, have proved indispensable for Ukraine for their ability to penetrate through Russian anti-missile defenses and are likely to become a staple of NATO's military arsenal in future conflicts. Poland's own missile defense system has been improved by a $4.75 billion order of Patriot missiles from the United States. Not to neglect aerial combat, Poland is also looking to buy an array of helicopters and drones from America or whatever other ally will provide such equipment. 48 Fa-50 light attack aircraft have also been purchased from South Korea to diversify the speed and mobility of Poland's air support. The mustering of all these impressive pieces of military hardware could lead to the fulfillment of Poland's promise to itself and its allies, becoming the strongest military power on land in Central and Eastern Europe. The United States military understands the key importance of Poland's location and agreed to allow their 5th Army Corps to reside permanently within the country. Poland, developing more potent land forces, is the most sensible option for its own defense, as well as giving the Republic a distinctly advantageous position as the eastern bulwark of NATO. The ease with which Poland can roll out the heavy artillery in mainland Europe is especially relevant because of the ongoing imperialist actions of Russia. The conflict in Ukraine is only the most recent example of Russian aggression, and given that Poland shares a border with Ukraine, there's a lot of justification for Poland to be concerned about its own protection. Russian military command has all but signaled direct hostility toward Poland with inflammatory and dehumanizing statements, such as those made by Dmitry Medvedev, deputy chairman of the Russian Security Council. I see no point in maintaining diplomatic relations with Poland. This state must not exist for us while there is no one but Russophobes in power, and Ukraine is full of Polish mercenaries who should be ruthlessly exterminated like stinky rats. Further remarks from the Kremlin indicate a desire to denazify Poland in a blatant attempt to justify the possibility of another annexation effort. In the process, Russia's also removed memorials that honored Polish people killed at the hands of Soviet soldiers in the past, a callous and ahistorical attempt at downplaying their country's own brutal past. Threats of nuclear brinksmanship in the form of stationing missiles on Poland's eastern border have also raised concerns about how far Russia is willing to go. This open hostility toward Poland from the Russian government is distressing, but sadly it's not unfamiliar. Just like in the years leading up to World War II, an expansionist dictator with a mind for empire building is threatening to conquer much of Europe. And in this case, it's not Germany, but the other country that Poland has a troubled history with. But it's not just invading forces like Russia that history's made Poland wary of. The German invasion and the Soviet occupation both share one common factor. When Poland was in need, the other Allied superpowers did not readily give them the help they requested. On a national level, the push for self-sufficiency is not simply a philosophical preference for growing stronger, it's also a bitter acknowledgement that the nation may have nobody else to rely on. On 2022's Polish Independence Day, the country's Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said, "The Polish army must be so powerful that it does not have to fight due to its strength alone." The silver lining to this current moment is that the world is much more aware of and engaged in the project of stopping Russia from carrying on its war in Ukraine. The United States has shown itself to be a stalwart ally of Ukraine in regards to sending weapons and denouncing Russia's actions, and the emphasis on foreign policy under the administration of President Biden could set a precedent that extends to Poland in the case of the worst. The former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO, Dr. Shea, had this to say in regards to Poland's militarization. "What Poland is doing is very welcome, but it won't make sense going at it alone." This statement could be seen as an indication that NATO has no intention of underserving Poland in any upcoming skirmish, but skepticism remains among Polish leadership as larger and more concrete promises have been made and broken before. Yet Morawiecki has not signaled any lack of trust in his allies and disagreed with former President Emmanuel Macron of France over whether the goal of European autonomy from the United States is a worthwhile one. While visiting Washington, the Prime Minister made clear his intention to seek a closer bond between Poland and the US, stating that if countries west of Poland do not understand why such an alliance is necessary, it was probably due to historical circumstances. Poland is trying to maintain the most common-sense policy based on a close alliance with the United States within the framework of the European Union, and this is the best path for Poland. Though the fighting in Ukraine is far from over, and Poland has not officially entered the war, being prepared for a ground invasion from Russia is worth the cost in their eyes. Poland cannot allow itself to suffer a modern equivalent to the Charge at Kroyanta, not in sensationalized mythology or cold hard reality. And furthermore, it might not be able to afford to wait for distant allies in the event of a Russian attack, or rely on the goodwill of other world powers in case of a challenge to its sovereignty. In order to be NATO's first line of defense against Russia, Poland has chosen to spend 3% of its GDP on defense, the highest allocation of defense budget in the region. Greece is the second highest in Europe, with 2.8% of its GDP going to defense, and its pockets for foreign weapons are not as deep. At least not as deep as Poland is willing to go in order to face down the profound threat of Putin's Russia. To quote Polish General Rajmund Andrzejczak in a recent press conference, "We just took our suitcases with money and we're going like hell around the world trying to buy. It's not a matter of money. I've got money. I've got big money." The aforementioned tanks and rocket launchers are only the beginning, but as for where the economic wealth to pay for the surge of military might come from, the answers are surprisingly simple. The diaspora of Polish tradespeople who emigrated to other countries over the past century has begun to return to the country with much higher net worths for themselves and their families. The capitalist success of Poles overseas in the United States of America, as well as throughout several regions of Europe, has directly caused wealth to flow back to the homeland. Wealth that can now be used to reinvest in a future without the threat of being bowled over by a mightier power. Whether the GDP of Poland can truly bear the weight of this costly investment remains to be seen, but the success story has a sensational appeal to it. This emphasis on the achievements of talented workers who are loyal to and enrich their nation is in some way a modern reflection of the values of solidarity. But if all these indications are correct, nonviolence may not be the direction in which the country goes. With all this military spending in the name of maintaining stability and self-sufficiency, Poland runs the risk of accelerating tensions and creating a deepened climate of hostility. The newfound focus on expanding the defense budget could be exactly what the right-wing Law and Justice Party is looking for to maintain power and approval, and what would begin as a justified emphasis on national security could grow into a warmongering rhetoric if left unchecked. Robert Chulda, a military expert from the Casimir Pulaski Foundation, is not so convinced of the practicality of the plan nor impressed by the appeals to the collective. He states, "It seems highly likely that such a large scale of planned orders is largely driven by a political populism aimed at gaining popularity here and now, rather than to be a real, comprehensive, and well-thought-out plan for harmoniously strengthening the armed forces." On the other hand, historical precedent has shown us that appeasement is ineffective when it comes to totalitarians like Putin, and show of force might be the only viable solution to the mounting problem of Russian imperialism. Whether it's a ploy for re-election or not, the fact of the matter is that the economic risk is a less devastating one than the risk of Poland being subject to one more occupation by an autocracy. Should these ambitious goals be completed within their time frame, Poland is all but guaranteed to become a military power that can serve as NATO's backbone within the region.
In 2017, Russia conducted a series of military exercises known as Zapad, or Exercise West. With their roots in the Soviet Union, Zapad military exercises have traditionally been shows of force, meant to let NATO know that Russia was willing and ready to fight. Despite assurances that Russia's 2017 Zapad exercises were nothing more than preparations for counter-terror operations, an exercise that was supposed to feature only 10,000 personnel turned into a 100,000-strong mock invasion of Eastern Europe with one clear message: Russia's military might is back. Today, we look into a very scary scenario. In this episode of the Infographic Show, can Russia really invade Europe? After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia's military severely atrophied, and despite remaining a sizable force, its readiness and capabilities were all but defunct. The next 2 decades saw little improvement, culminating in the 2008 Georgian-Russian War, where Russia, who dwarfed Georgian forces, found itself struggling to achieve its strategic objectives. After such an embarrassing performance, Vladimir Putin vowed to improve the readiness and capabilities of the Russian military, culminating in a 10-year modernization push that has yielded huge results. While still mostly a conscript army, Russia's military is seeing a huge expansion in the size of its volunteer forces, an important development given the drastically better performance and morale of an all-volunteer military force such as the US versus a conscripted force. New battle tanks and fighter aircraft have also dramatically improved its capabilities both in the air and on the ground, and while its fleets remain a glaring weakness, they would ultimately have limited use in a European war. Russia has also dramatically improved its logistical capabilities, something that it has historically struggled with even under the former Soviet Union. Heavy road transport units for ferrying armor to the front lines via road networks has reduced Russia's reliance on rail transport to get its tanks to the front lines, with rail lines being a natural first target for NATO bombardment. Russia has also doubled down on the one area it has traditionally outperformed NATO in: ground-based anti-air platforms. The introduction of the S-400 and the future deployment of the S-500 anti-air defense system has given NATO war planners serious concerns, and with a range of up to 250 miles, a single battery of S-400 units can threaten large swaths of a European battlefield. Russia has also invested heavily into modernizing its non-strategic nuclear forces, outpacing even the US in this arena. Russia's investments in improved logistics, deadly air defense units, and an upgraded nuclear missile force have clearly signaled its intentions to Russia's observers, and the Zapad 2017 military exercises only confirmed their worst fears. Russia is preparing for, and quite possibly fully ready for, a military invasion of Eastern Europe. So, could it actually do so? NATO maintains an active duty force of about 2 million personnel versus Russia's 1 million. NATO also maintains an air force of 13,000 fighter, strike, and bomber aircraft versus Russia's 3,914. It is on the ground, however, where Russia has the biggest advantage, with over 20,000 tanks versus NATO's 10,000. Yet Russia's official figure has to be taken with a huge grain of salt, as Russia still counts many thousands of decommissioned Soviet-era tanks in its official figures. Not only would these tanks take weeks to recommission and get ready for combat, but they would be wholly outclassed and outgunned by NATO's overwhelmingly modern tank forces. Despite NATO's technologically superior and more numerous forces, though, the military alliance has two glaring Achilles heels that Russia is poised to exploit. The first is that the bulk of NATO's capabilities rest with the United States, which does maintain a readiness doctrine of being able to fight and win two high-intensity wars at the same time, yet whose forces are geographically distant from Europe, with the bulk of American firepower stationed across the Atlantic. In case of war against Russia, the US's forces in Europe would fight in a defensive posture, awaiting the arrival of supplemental forces from the American homeland, which could take weeks. NATO's second Achilles heel is the lackluster commitment from its European member states to the military portion of the alliance. Out of the 29 member states, only 8 have hit the 2% of GDP investment in their militaries, creating an imbalance of commitment across the alliance. While various factors contribute to this lackluster commitment to their own defense, many watchdogs argue that NATO members have become too comfortable living under a global American security blanket, a position that has become very popular with American President Donald Trump. Not only is the lack of appropriate funding weakening NATO as a whole, but the political schisms it has created have only been compounded by President Trump's actions and statements, throwing into serious question American commitment to NATO's Article 5. An attack on one is an attack on the whole. While the American people overwhelmingly support the defense of their European allies in the case of war, should the worst come to pass, it will ultimately be up to the American president how he responds. This uncertainty within the alliance, first in its history, has been capitalized on by Russia, as evidenced by the true scope of its Zapad 2017 exercises. Originally stated to be nothing more than a 10,000-strong counter-terrorism set of fast response exercises, the affair quickly grew to include over 100,000 personnel, sea, land, and air fire support platforms, and hordes of Russian armor. To To military observers, the scope of the exercises and even their execution were crystal clear. Russia was practicing a full-scale invasion of the Baltic states. After the Russian invasion of the Ukraine in 2014, NATO bolstered its forces in its member states of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, deploying 4 multinational battalion-sized battle groups on a permanent rotational basis. As NATO's most vulnerable states, the 4 countries have long feared what they have seen as rising Russian aggression, and know that in the case of war, they will be the first to fight. That is because in the case of war, Russia will immediately conduct an all-out offensive across Belarus into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, while cutting off Poland and thus continental Europe from its allies by striking out over the Suwalki Gap, a 60-mile stretch of NATO territory that connects the Russian military stronghold of Kaliningrad with Belarus. By putting pressure on Poland and launching long-range air and missile strikes against NATO facilities in Germany, Russia would delay any response to its invasions of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Unfortunately for the 3, the flat plains of Eastern Europe would make defensive operations incredibly difficult, especially against large masses of Russian tanks. It was these same flat plains that saw some of World War II's largest tank battles, and will see them again should Russia launch World War III. Cut off from NATO support, the 3 Baltic nations would not hold long against Russia. Yet within a matter of weeks, US forces would arrive en masse, and NATO would be poised for a devastating counterattack that Russia could not hope to stop. This is where Russia would enact the second part of its European strategy, nuclear brinkmanship. Having already threatened the capitals of several Baltic states with nuclear attacks in the case of war in the early 2010s, President Putin has been carefully cultivating the perception of a strong willingness to use nuclear weapons. Whether real or not, any NATO response would have to take into account the possibility that Putin is not bluffing, and he may in fact resort to the use of nuclear weapons in case of war. Indeed, he very well may have no other choice. Russia has zero hope of ever defeating a fully mobilized NATO alliance, and though it may be poised to strike deep into Eastern Europe and even hold that territory for a time, it would never ultimately be able to make these gains permanent. NATO forces and member states' economies are simply far superior to Russia's own. Launching such a war would prove devastating for Moscow, and though Putin could make the conflict an extremely bloody one for NATO, fighting could very realistically reach the very outskirts of Moscow itself, as Russia once more fights a catastrophically defensive war for survival, though this time against a far superior foe. This would leave Russia with only one option: use of its nuclear arsenal to avoid all-out defeat. This would trigger a retaliatory response from the West. A Russia with its back up against the wall may choose to launch a limited set of nuclear strikes against purely military targets, hoping to limit the scope of NATO's own nuclear response. Even if NATO responded in kind with a limited range of nuclear strikes against Russian military forces, such a nuclear exchange would be disastrous to the world as a whole, with untold ecological and economic fallout. All of these variables are well known to President Putin, and in fact, he may one day be counting on them as he launches a brief but aggressive war to seize the Baltic states. By then shoring up his position and threatening the use of nuclear weapons, he may in fact force NATO to sue for peace rather than risk escalating the scope of the conflict. Not only would Russia win large amounts of territory for itself in such a war, but it would win a truly game-changing political victory by completely undermining the fundamental tenets of NATO, that the alliance will fight to protect all member states. This could potentially lead to a fracturing of NATO, or at the very least, kill the confidence of current and prospective member states, weakening the West, which has for decades been Russia's ultimate goal.
Francis Brighton crashes through the doors and into the war room where a group of generals sit. He is a NATO intelligence officer and has come across something truly horrifying. The military leaders turn in their seats to look at him. "Sir, you need to see this," Francis says, holding out a manila folder containing images taken by a spy satellite. The general slowly reaches for the folder, opens it, and begins flipping through the pages. His brow furrows in concern. The general shakes his head and passes the folder to the person sitting next to him. "God save us," he whispers, as the photographs circulate around the table. Francis waits patiently in a corner of the room while each member of the NATO alliance looks at the photos he brought with him. The last general examines the images, closes the folder, and hands it back to Francis. He turns to the rest of the men in the room. "What should we do?" he asks. There's discussion about launching a counterattack. Some NATO members want to keep the status quo the way it is. Putin is clearly insane, and like any wild animal that's backed into a corner and feels threatened, he is more than willing to lash out in the most deadly way possible. Others in the room believe now is the time to act. They advocate for the deployment of more troops along the Russian border. "I'm going to say what everyone else is thinking," one of the generals states as he stands up from the table. "We need to arm the nukes currently stationed in France and Britain." An eerie silence envelops the room. Francis shifts back and forth on his heels. He's remained quiet until now. "If I may, sir," he says, "the images clearly show that Russia's moving tactical nukes from this Object S site to their naval base on the Black Sea. However, we do not know if this is just a posturing gesture or if Putin means to use them." The generals around the room grumble. They all know this could be the first step toward nuclear war. Until this point, Vladimir Putin's only threatened to use tactical nukes in his war against Ukraine. Now he actually has taken steps to put those words into action. The deployment of several tactical nukes, each with an estimated payload of 1 kiloton or 1,000 sticks of dynamite, could change the world forever. The generals continue to deliberate. "Commander Brighton," one of them says, "we need you back at your post. Keep your eyes on the Russian nukes and update us of any further movements." Francis salutes the general and runs out of the room. He sprints down the hallways of the intelligence building back to the command center. Screens flash different images. TVs play live feeds from news outlets around the world. No one knows about the very real threat that he has uncovered except for the NATO generals. Francis types vigorously on the keys of his keyboard. He glances at the picture next to his screen. It's a photo of his wife holding their newborn daughter. She smiles as if nothing could ever get in the way of their happiness. Unfortunately, Putin seems hell-bent on doing just that, by throwing Europe into a nuclear war. Francis taps back into the satellite feed that he initially spotted the tactical nukes from. He zooms in on the road leading from the Russian nuclear base to the Black Sea coast. The trucks carrying the tactical nukes have made significant progress. They're only miles away from the naval base. Hours pass. Francis periodically sends updates to the NATO generals regarding the movement of the Russian tactical nukes. Putin had promised to use them for several weeks, but many thought this was an empty threat. Now it looks like he's about to make good on what he's been saying all along. There's been little movement on the Russian naval base where the nukes were dropped off. Francis has a hunch the warheads have been mounted onto SSN-38 caliber missiles and loaded onto Russian subs, but without proof, there is very little he can do. It seems like the only way that Russia could secretly deploy the nukes and get them within range of targets in Ukraine is by submarine. Francis's eyes are exhausted from looking at computer monitors nonstop for days. Every time he blinks, it stings. The intelligence officer stands up and stretches. He walks to the break room where a fresh pot of coffee is just finished brewing. As he pours himself a cup, he watches live coverage of the battle raging on the outskirts of Kyiv. Suddenly, the camera tilts upward. For a moment, a missile can be seen screaming across the sky. It arcs down and slams into the ground near a group of Ukrainian forces. For a moment, nothing happens. Then, there's a bright flash and the feed cuts off. Francis stares wide-eyed at the static on the television. The coffee mug falls from his hands and shatters on the floor. For a moment, Francis is paralyzed with fear. It is very clear what he just witnessed. Russia launched a tactical nuke and wiped out everything in a quarter-mile radius. Francis sprints back to the control room and begins gathering as much intel as possible. He needs to figure out how much damage was done and in which direction the fallout is heading. By looking at satellite feeds, Francis can just make out the distinctive mushroom cloud rising up over the landscape. The wind seems to be blowing smoke further into Ukraine. Once again, Russia has caused a nuclear catastrophe on Ukrainian soil. Later that day, Francis gives a report to the NATO generals. It appears Russia used a 1-kiloton tactical nuke to destroy an entire Ukrainian tank battalion. Reports have been coming in across the world that countries are condemning Russia's actions. Everyone knows that if nuclear war breaks out, there will be no winners. Russia and the US alone have enough nukes to wipe humanity off the face of the planet, and that's not accounting for the nuclear warheads located in Britain and France. After the blast was confirmed to be from a tactical nuke, NATO armed several missiles at sites across Europe. They have not fired yet, but it seems that'll only be a matter of time before someone has to stand up to Vladimir Putin. Trying to reason with the homicidal maniac doesn't seem to be working. Even China, Russia's most powerful ally, has turned on them. China has a strict no-first-use nuclear doctrine, which Russia has just broken. In the eyes of China, nukes should only be used to defend one's own country, not as a weapon for offensive purposes. This is how much of the world feels, and it's the reason why almost every country on the planet has turned against Vladimir Putin. But as far as Francis can tell, this doesn't seem to be deterring the leader of the Russian Federation. Russia used the tactical nuke to show just how serious they were taking NATO's constant resupplying of Ukraine with weapons and supplies. Putin also wanted to make it clear he had no problem taking things to the next level and engaging in nuclear warfare. Europe is now in an even more tenuous position. In briefings that Francis has been a part of, all options were put on the table. Many leaders believed that NATO needs to launch a nuke at Russia to show they will not just back down. The flip side of this is that Putin could escalate things further and start firing larger strategic nukes at targets across Europe. this happens, the entire continent could be decimated by fireballs and nuclear fallout. The tactical nuke that Putin fired obliterated everything within a quarter mile, and although the radiation from the blast will travel further, it's nothing compared to the much larger nukes that both Russia and NATO have at their disposal. These bombs can be 1,000 times more powerful than the tactical nuke that Russia used, and each one could wipe out entire cities and cause millions of casualties. This is obviously what Europe is trying to avoid, but they also can't let Putin get away with unleashing a nuke on the people of Ukraine. Francis listens to the other options being suggested by the military leaders in the room. Some of the generals think that NATO should send forces into Russia and use conventional weapons to bring Putin to his knees. The counter-argument is obvious. If forces from Europe invade Russia, Putin will almost certainly launch more nukes to defend his homeland, resulting in the annihilation of much of Europe. Another option is to tighten the economic sanctions already placed on Russia. Unfortunately, these didn't seem to stop Putin the first time around, and it's unlikely they'll cause him to back down now. Economic sanctions also won't help deter Putin from using more nuclear bombs. It's determined that this could actually cause him to escalate things further as more countries turn against him. Even though China and most other countries are upset with Putin's actions, Russia still supplies a massive amount of oil and gas to the rest of the world. This includes Europe. And if Russia completely cuts off fossil fuel supplies to the EU, everyone within its borders will suffer. Utility prices across Europe have already skyrocketed to unprecedented levels as Russia continues to cut off its supply of oil, and many European families can no longer afford to heat their homes during the cold winter months. Then, one of the generals comes up with an idea so crazy, it might just work. Francis sits at his computer station staring blankly at his screen. He can't believe the decision the generals came to. He closes his eyes and rubs the bridge of his nose. "Forgive us," he whispers, and then focuses on the task at hand. Francis moves several satellites into optimal viewing positions, which will allow them to collect analytics for what is about to happen. The satellites align and begin transmitting data. They're pointed at a military base in Belarus. A digital clock has begun countdown. The generals are now in the control room with Francis so they can witness the aftermath of their choices. Belarus is not at war with Europe. The country is controlled by Alexander Lukashenko, a power-hungry dictator who allied himself closely with Putin. There's no doubt that Belarus supports Russia in its endeavors, but the Belarusian military is not actively slaughtering people in Ukraine like Russia is, nor do they have any nuclear weapons. Francis and the generals watch as the countdown reaches zero. On one of the side monitors, a video feed of a missile launching from a British battleship in the Baltic Sea is being played. The satellites track the missile as it arcs through the sky and descends upon a Belarusian military base. Unknowing soldiers carry out their daily routines. The seconds tick by. Everyone in the room holds their breath. Then, confirmation comes through that the tactical nuke launched by NATO has detonated and destroyed its target. Francis feels sick to his stomach. The men on the base had no idea what was coming or that they were even in any danger. Now they've been vaporized by a nuclear blast. One of the generals claps his hands together. "Someone get me the Kremlin on the phone." Maybe now Putin will talk, but he doesn't. The plan was to show that NATO was not afraid to use its own nuclear weapons. Military leaders knew they could not launch a nuke at Russia to demonstrate their resolve, but it was determined that by blowing up a target in Belarus, they could still send a clear message to Vladimir Putin that NATO would retaliate with nukes if necessary. There's no doubt that Alexander Lukashenko is a terrible man who's done terrible things to the people in his country, but many feel like NATO took things a step too far. Belarus was sided already with Russia and has given them support in their fight against Ukraine, but now the Eastern European country has declared war on the rest of Europe. They do not have the military forces to back up the threats they're making, but Russia's made it clear that it will stand with Belarus and aid them in their war against the other countries in Europe. NATO leaders knew this would be inevitable, but hoped their show of force would cause Putin to back down slightly. However, this plan hinged on the belief that Putin, like everyone else around the world, wouldn't want to risk all-out nuclear war. But Vladimir Putin is not a sane human being, and therefore his actions following the show of force by NATO are not rational. Both Russia's decision to use a tactical nuke in Ukraine and NATO's choice to fire their own nuclear missile at Belarus have put the continent in a very tumultuous position. Countries around the world are condemning both sides and begging for everyone to come to the table and discuss what's happening before things escalate to levels from which the world might never return. Francis never agreed with the decision to show that Europe would also use nukes if Putin didn't back down. However, his intel has proved invaluable to the generals of NATO. When Vladimir Putin sent a communication that he wanted to sit down for peace talks, everyone was ecstatic. A delegation was sent to the Ukrainian border, where NATO ambassadors would meet with top officials from Russia. Francis was asked to come along to provide the latest intel about where Russian troops were located. Hopefully, this information could be used as leverage to show Russia that they were always being closely watched. It would also serve as proof that NATO knew about key military installations and was not afraid to target them if Russia failed to cooperate. Francis is reluctant to go, but he knows it's his duty, and hopefully the intel he provides can help the two sides come to an agreement. Before he leaves his station, Francis pulls the picture of his wife and baby off the side of his screen and puts it in his pocket. Francis and the delegation of NATO diplomats head to the Ukrainian border. They land on a military airfield in Poland and are escorted to the border by NATO forces. As they cross over to Ukraine and enter the small town where the talks are supposed to take place, something seems off. The convoy comes to a stop. The delegates step out to look around. It's quiet. There's no sign of the Russian representatives. Maybe they're just running late, someone suggests. The group heads to the town hall where Russia initially agreed to begin peace talks. They enter the building. It's cold and empty. Cobwebs hang from the ceiling. It's clear no one has been here for a very long time. Something is very wrong. "I suggest we get back to the airbase," one of the soldiers says. Francis looks around. He closes his eyes and tightly grips the picture of his wife and daughter in his pocket. He should have seen this coming. He should have kept a closer eye on the movements of the Russian troops in the area. Initially, when Francis noticed that the Russian forces were pulling back, he thought it was a sign of good faith. He just presumed the Russians didn't want to seem threatening, especially during peace talks. Now he realizes how stupid that train of thought was. Just like everyone else, Francis wanted this conflict to end without nuclear war. The Russian forces were not pulling back as a sign of their willingness to engage in peace talks. They were retreating because of what was about to happen next. Suddenly, an intelligence officer stationed back at the airbase begins shouting over the comms. "Missile incoming! Get out of there!" the voice yells. A tear rolls down Francis's cheek. A moment later, there's a bright flash. A massive explosion erupts out of the nuclear warhead as it detonates, vaporizing the NATO delegation and ending the peace talks. At the same moment as the nuke on the Ukrainian border detonates, Russia launches several more tactical nukes into Kyiv. Although this will destroy most of the city and irradiate the surrounding area, the Russians need to eliminate the Ukrainian resistance once and for all to prove their dominance. They do not send troops or tanks across the border into Europe, as they had a hard enough time fighting against Ukraine and would never succeed in capturing the rest of Europe using conventional warfare. EU's leaders watch in horror as Russia launches nuke after nuke. They have not targeted any of Europe's major cities yet. Instead, their targets all seem to be Ukrainian military installations. Russia's showing the world they have escalated their wartime tactics to use tactical nukes. Regular missiles are now all but obsolete. The benefit of using these smaller nuclear weapons is that there's less destruction and fallout, but they still decimate any enemy force in the vicinity. Putin makes it known that if Europe or any NATO nations try to invade his country or launch a counterattack, he's not afraid to unleash his whole nuclear arsenal on Europe. NATO leaders scramble to decide what to do next. Do they launch their own nukes and engage in an all-out nuclear war with no winner? Or do they increase sanctions and mobilize forces to keep Russia from expanding any further into Europe? France and Germany launch ground forces and set up heavy defensive positions along the Ukrainian border. Poland asks for reinforcements as Belarusian military forces cross their border and attack any soldiers or civilians in sight as retaliation for NATO launching a nuke at their country. A major fear is that Russia will sell or gift tactical nukes to Belarus, who will then launch them against NATO forces in Europe. At this point, they could make a strong case to justify such an action. Nuclear war seems all but inevitable. For several weeks, Russia does not seem interested in an invasion of Europe. European countries and their allies struggle to figure out the best way to de-escalate the situation with Putin and his loose trigger finger. Thus far, all of the nuclear warheads fired by Russia have been around a kiloton, meaning that no strategic or megaton nukes have been launched yet. It seems like Europe continues to let Putin get away with murder, but NATO is trying its best to avoid a catastrophic war that will lead to nuclear winter. European leaders have been thrown into an unwinnable situation. They either roll over and let Vladimir Putin get away with his egregious atrocities, or they launch their own offensive and deal with the inevitable nuclear consequences. Europe has completely stopped purchasing oil, gas, and goods from Russia. This has hurt the people and the economies of the nations in the EU, but it was a necessary step. Russia's economy has all but collapsed, yet they still have a large influence over oil exports. Not only do they control where their own fossil fuels go, but they also have influence over the other OPEC countries in the Middle East. And even though China condemned the actions of Russia, they rely too heavily on their natural resources to cut ties completely. The suffering in Europe is exacerbated by the fact that every country must ramp up military production and recruitment. Without its main supply of oil and gas, there are not enough resources to go around. Europe has been moving away from fossil fuels and toward using renewable energy, but at this point, it's too little too late. Things become desperate as Germany's economy goes into a depression and the British pound becomes worthless. European nations decide it's time to fight back against the evil dictator of Russia. France and Germany launch air raids across the border. The British Navy fires cannons at Russian naval bases and blockade major ports. Infantry and armor units amass along main strategic points, and when the signal's given, cross into Russian territory. There's carnage and chaos across the continent. As Russian forces are defeated and pushed back, Putin makes the decision that everyone was afraid of but knew was coming. He fires tactical nukes at NATO forces. Nuclear bombs detonate on land and in sea. The British Navy in the Baltic is decimated. In a day, millions of lives are lost, but eventually Putin knows he will either run out of tactical nukes or soldiers, so he does the unthinkable. Warning lights flash across every surveillance center in Europe. Russia has launched hundreds of nukes from its arsenals. These are not the low-yield tactical nukes. Each one is over a megaton. When the warheads explode, they will demolish entire cities and wipe out military forces across Europe. There's no other choice but to fight back. Britain and France launched their own nukes at Moscow and other Russian targets. The rest of the world watches in horror as Europe is consumed by fireballs and covered in radiation. Most of Russia's forces are destroyed when the nukes from Europe explode on Russian soil. For the next several decades, most of Europe will be uninhabitable as the fallout spreads across the continent on shifting winds. The end of Vladimir Putin's reign comes at a cost of an irradiated European continent. It all started with a single tactical nuke launched from a Russian sub at Ukrainian forces. It's a grim outlook for the future of Europe if Putin ever does decide to use nuclear weapons. If this happens, decisions about what to do will be difficult to make. There will likely be mistakes, and many people will die as a result of Vladimir Putin's cavalier use of tactical nukes. There are no good options when it comes to nuclear warfare. This is why no one has used a nuke in combat since 1945, when the United States dropped the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The situation in Ukraine might be the closest we've been to nuclear destruction since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Except in the current situation, it's not the Soviet Union and the United States who have to come to some sort of agreement, but the leaders of Europe and Vladimir Putin. Hopefully, just as the crisis in 1962 was averted, we can avoid a nuclear holocaust in the coming months.
We'll start today's show with a bit of a disclaimer. We understand that all European kids from all 50 European countries and transnational nations can't all be lumped into one. That's not our objective today. What we'll try to do is take a look at how kids from some European countries compare to American kids in certain respects. How are their lifestyles different? How is schooling different? What kind of habits do they have? Who seems to have a better standard of living? Who gets arrested more? Who drinks alcohol with abandon and is not yet out of their teenage years? Who gets married young or has kids at a young age? Things like that, and more. So without further ado, welcome to this episode of the Infographic Show, American Kids versus European Kids. Let's start with something pretty much all kids do, and that's go to school. You might have seen Michael Moore's 2015 documentary, Where to Invade Next. In his film, Moore visits Finland, where he says students study relatively few hours, have no standardized testing, put an emphasis on the creative arts, and learn more and feel happier at school than American kids. Indeed, if you look at education systems across the world and which are supposed to be the best, Finland is higher than the USA in terms of how students are performing. In 2016, a report by the World Economic Forum put Finland in first place. Writing about that report, the independent newspaper said, Finland routinely tops rankings of global education systems and is famous for having no banding systems. All pupils, regardless of ability, are taught in the same classes. There is said to be hardly any homework and hardly any testing. Also, above America on that top 10 list were Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, Ireland, and Estonia. It's hard to say which country has the best education though. Many Asian nations have students that perform well, but school can be a very stressful environment and studying hours can be long. But we're talking about the US and Europe today. We should also add that the Human Capital Index report for 2017, which ranks countries' students in terms of how well they will perform when let loose in the global economic system, ranks the USA in fourth place behind Norway, Finland, and Switzerland. We might add that once many students in Europe finish high school, their university education will be free. This includes Austria, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Scotland, and Slovenia, while Germany, France, and Italy won't make you break the bank to get a university education. CNBC reported in 2018 that the average student that borrowed in the USA will have a debt of $37,172 once they graduate. It's this albatross around some students' necks that makes it difficult for some American young adults to get ahead after graduation. But it's about the same in the UK. How do we round this up? Well, there are ample reports out there about how streaming students, standardized testing, stressful exams, and constant monitoring of student data is making students ill in countries such as the USA, UK, Australia, and Singapore. The media reports that some European countries that we have mentioned have opted for a much more pleasant way of teaching. and in some of those countries, students are doing well academically. Couple that with free university education, and all we can say is that some European students have it much easier than most American students. And we've all seen those American high school movies, usually depicting the bad boys and hot girls getting it on, acting goofy around their bongs, and getting into trouble with the cops. Are American kids really all that wild? If we look at statistics, most adolescent pregnancies, age 15 to 19, occur in the undeveloped world. If we look at countries in Europe regarding teenage pregnancies per 1,000 people, we are told that the European Union, on average, is at 11 per 1,000. The USA scored higher at 24 per 1,000. The highest rate in Europe was in Romania, Bulgaria, Malta, and Hungary. In 2016, The Atlantic wrote that in the USA, the rate has been declining, but it's also one of the highest in the developed world. As for when kids or young adults are losing their virginity, it seems most media are citing one source, but that data is Durex's Face of Global Sex report and is from 2012. It didn't even include most of the countries where teenage pregnancy is highest, such as the countries in the continent of Africa. But in Europe, Iceland had the lowest average age of losing your virginity, said to be at 15.6. The Nordic countries came next, Denmark at 16.1, Sweden at 16.2, Norway at 16.5, and Finland at 16.5. It might seem those kids were educated enough to use contraceptives. The average age of virginity loss in the USA was 18, just below the UK at 18.3. What does all this tell us about getting it on? Not much, just that Nordic countries seem to be getting it on at a very young age and not getting pregnant. As for delinquency, we are told the USA locks up more of its young than any other country in the world. It's difficult to find statistics for all youth crime across Europe, but we can find many articles on youth crime, mainly drug-related crime, stabbing, and assaults, in cities such as London, Glasgow, and Manchester in the UK. You may have seen the reports in 2018 that for the first time, London's murder rate climbed higher than New York's, and if you read any of the stories, it seems the victims and the murderers were often youths. Still, on the whole, it seems the USA is perhaps a more violent place to live than Europe when you're a teenager. Of course, it depends on where you live, but statistically, you have more chance of being a murdered teen in America. But let's look at some of the laws in the US compared to Europe. For instance, when do young people get to first drink or smoke or get married legally? Or back to losing your virginity again, when is that legal? America is quite strict when it comes to drinking, with the age limit set at 21 if one is purchasing booze. This has shocked many Europeans who visited the US and got turned away from bars or trying to buy some beer from the store. In most of Europe, the legal purchasing age is 18, although in parts of Austria, 16-year-olds can buy beer from the store. Danish 16-year-olds can too, but if the booze is stronger than 16.5%, they must be 18. It's about the same in Germany and Switzerland. Iceland has the strictest laws in Europe with an age limit of 20. Does this mean European teens drink more? Well, if you've seen our other comparison shows, you'll know a lot of the world's biggest alcohol consumers are European countries. World Atlas tells us the top 3 in 2017 were Belarus, Moldova, and Lithuania. The top 25 list is packed with European nations, with only Australia and South Korea joining all other European nations. But we're talking about teens, not everyone. So, Vox published an article in 2016 citing a study on binge drinking in the US versus Europe. The magazine cites a study by the World Health Organization with the subtitle, "Percent of 15 to 19-year-olds who reportedly binge drink defined as drinking at least 60 grams or more of pure alcohol on at least one occasion in the past 30 days. Guess what? American kids seem to be drinking less than most of Europe, with only 19.8% of those teens binging on booze. Germany led Europe at 50.6%, France was behind at 48.5%, and the UK third at 40.5%. It seems Latvian kids drink the least, but just about everywhere you go in Europe, according to this study anyway, kids out-boozed American kids. By the way, there are exceptions in the US when it comes to drinking alcohol you haven't purchased, such as in private homes or some other places, as long as you have parental consent. The same goes for most countries. As for smoking cigarettes, the legal age is mostly 18 in the US, although in 2017, the Washington Post published an article saying that Oregon had just become the 5th state to move the purchasing age of cigarettes to 21. You'll find in Europe the legal age for buying your smokes is also 18, with a few countries having a 16 age limit. Who smokes the most? There is something called the Global Youth Tobacco Survey, and this shows how many kids aged 13 to 15 years old smoke, with 108 countries surveyed. Yet again, it seems European teens on the whole had worse habits. Italy, Romania, Bulgaria, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Latvia were especially bad. According to CBS, teens in Maine in the USA smoke the most, but they are still making healthier choices than many kids in European countries. The stats differ though, because the age ranges change in each study. Still, it seems American kids in general smoke less than European kids. As for how old you must be to legally have sex, that's not always easy to answer, as there are often conditions. In the USA, the age of consent is somewhere between 16 and 18, depending on where you live. We can't go through all European countries, but the continent is fairly evenly split between 14, 15, and 16. Only Malta, Turkey, and Vatican City impose an age of consent of 18. So if you're a German or Italian teen, whatever you do, don't go thinking that on your trip to the USA, you can just start sleeping around with 14-year-olds. That can get you in serious trouble. So, with all this in mind, who are the happiest kids? The Guardian published a piece in 2018 saying it was Dutch kids. They apparently, on average, have a good lifestyle, healthy family relationships, and school isn't too stressful. The article is citing a UNICEF Office of Research report and WHO surveys on the well-being of kids around the world. The UNICEF report gave a score for all factors under overall well-being, and European nations dominated the entire list. Netherlands, Norway, Iceland, Finland, and Sweden were the top 5, and you don't see another non-European nation until 17th, when Canada makes an entrance one place behind the UK. The USA was in 26th place. It depends which study you are reading though, as another that surveyed only 15-year-olds put America at just above average, Britain just below average, but still, the usual suspect European countries were at the top. The bottom of the list was filled by Asian countries. Why was that mostly? Anxiety over tests, where the UK and US also scored high.
When you picture iconic rebels of Scottish folklore, you probably picture William Wallace, as seen in Braveheart, charging into crowds of English troops with his blue face paint and broadsword. What you probably don't picture is a psychopathic, mass-murdering cannibal with a bloodthirsty family that's said to have killed upwards of 1,000 victims. We're talking about Alexander Sawney Bean, the Scottish king of cannibalism, and his terrifying brood, the Sawney Bean Cannibal Clan. If you're about to eat, put down the fork and listen in. It's gonna get gross. When exactly Sawney Bean and his family operated, if they ever existed at all, is an open question. Some sources have him being born as early as the late 12th century, while others place him as late as the 15th or 16th century. The mythic nature of the Bean Cannibal clan gives it a certain flexibility with the facts. Like many other disturbing folkloric figures, America has Mothman, England has Spring-Heeled Jack, and Scotland has Sawney Bean, who is undeniably the most gruesome of the national boogeymen. But according to most versions of the legend, Bean was born in the Scottish Council of East Lothian sometime before or during the reign of King James VI of Scotland. These were humble beginnings, as he was born into the poor homestead of a farm laborer. Not much is known about his birth family or childhood, but young Sawney is said to have done manual work like his father when he came of age, digging ditches and trimming hedges. However, things took a turn for the worst when this upstart young gentleman found love. Bean's crush, known as Black Agnes Douglas, was a woman of such low moral fiber that many thought her to be a witch. The two were a match made in hell. Sawney and Black Agnes eloped together, leaving the family and polite society for good. They robbed, fought, and even murdered for fun, like a brutal Scottish Bonnie and Clyde. This nightmare couple became so feared and scorned that they were forced to live off the grid to avoid being killed by angry mobs or the soldiers tasked with keeping the peace. Where did Sawney and Black Agnes decide to make their new home? If you guessed a dark, slimy sea cave, then ding ding ding, you are correct. The legends say that the two of them settled down across the country in Benin Cave in Ballantrae in Ayrshire. This cave wasn't just a glorified crack in the cliff face either. Benin Cave was a huge rock formation embedded with a complex series of mile-deep tunnels. The cave mouth would also be flooded twice a day at high tide, protecting the secret entrance from any outside intrusion. It was the perfect place to have an evil lair or to start a family. Or if you're Sawney Bean and Black Agnes, both. Sawney and Agnes got busy in every sense of the phrase, and soon enough, they had 14 more mouths to feed. If you thought that becoming a father and a family man would set Sawney on the straight and narrow, you'd be horrifically wrong. After all, without a real job, Sawney needed to find some way to feed his family. This encouraged him to take his crime game up to the next level. He started to rob and murder even more regularly, and somewhere along the line, Sawney acquired a taste for human flesh. The human flesh diet was one he quickly got his family to take up too, setting in motion a chain of events that would make the Sawney Bean clan the the most vicious family of killers in Scottish history. When his children became old enough to take up the family trade, which is to say murder, robbery, and cannibalism, they joined their mother and father in ambushing lonesome travelers on Scotland's backroads. The Bean Clan would murder those unfortunate passers-by and steal their clothes, cash, and valuables. They would then brutally hack their bodies into quarters before carrying them back to the cave for salting, cooking, and eating. To the untrained eye, it would just seem like the victim simply fell off the face of the earth, not leaving a single trace. Nobody knew that they were keeping the Bean Clan fed. This taboo precursor to the Atkins diet seemed to be working pretty well for the Bean family, because over their quarter-century reign of violence and terror, their numbers swelled massively. The family's 14 children bore Sonny and Black Agnes, 18 grandsons and 14 granddaughters, all the products of incest. The cave soon became home to 46 brutal, flesh-hungry savages of varying ages, unified in one purpose: killing, robbing, and eating anyone who dared to come near Benin Cave. With this new horde of loyal and hungry relatives, Sonny Bean upped his game yet again, organizing brutal attacks on whole groups of travelers. They would meticulously track and stalk their victims, waiting for the exact moment to strike. And when they finally did strike, it was like something out of a living nightmare. Picture this: you're a small trading convoy. It's perhaps you and some family members and a few business partners. You're transporting goods across the highlands to trade. Perhaps you've brought a weapon or two just as a precautionary measure. It'll be enough to frighten off one or two opportunistic bandits, surely. Then, as you're walking down a lonely country road, you hear an almost demonic screaming and howling echoing from all around you. You're so shocked by the sudden cacophony, you don't know what to do. You freeze as suddenly shapes come charging in all around you. They don't look like your average highwaymen. There's men, women, and children. They're filthy, bloodstained, crazed. Some wearing tattered fragments of stolen clothes and others completely naked, like the Celtic warriors they descended from. All of them are bearing knives, clubs, or fists, and they set upon you in a violent frenzy. Before you and your party can muster up any kind of defense or even a reaction beyond screaming and wide-eyed terror, it's too late. Your supplies are looted, and your dismembered corpses are being carried off to Benin Cave to be salted or pickled. According to the legends of the Bean Clan, this exact horrifying scenario played out hundreds of times over the 25 years that the brutal Cannibal clan was active. While they were typically extremely skilled at slaughtering whole groups of people without leaving any material evidence, occasionally some terrifying clues to what was truly going on would slip through the net. Leftovers from the Bean Clan's legendary cannibal feasts would sometimes wash out of the cave mouth and end up on Scotland's other shores. People who lived on the coasts would sometimes see cooked or eerily well-preserved limbs appear on the beaches, some covered in human-looking bite marks. The Sonny Bean Clan's activities were even affecting the local economy. When the body parts began to wash up with greater frequency, local authorities realized there must have been some prolific murderers on the loose. Local innkeepers were grilled by ye olde police in connection with the murders, seeing as they seemed like the most likely suspects, considering most of the recent disappearances had been travelers passing through. The pressure got so great that some local businesses even closed up shop for good, unable to cope with the severity of police scrutiny. Not that any of these leads ever led anywhere productive. Meanwhile, the Sonny Bean Clan continued to do what they do best: murder, robbery, and cannibalism. People were being falsely accused and executed for the Sonny Bean crimes, while these murderous Scots were getting away scot-free, pun intended. Villages near Benin Cave were becoming ghost towns as inns closed down and rumors spread that anyone who passed through the area was doomed to disappear and die a horrible death. And to be fair, could you really say this was inaccurate? The Sonny Bean Clan was impressively prolific, by some counts murdering more people than Gary Ridgway, Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and the Zodiac Killer combined. They were setting murderous world records. Of course, when you have such an impressive winning streak, it's unsurprising that you'd eventually let it go to your head. And when you get cocky, you get sloppy. This is exactly what happened one fateful night toward the end of the Bean Clan's tenure. A man and his wife were riding home on horseback from a local fair and happened to unknowingly wander into one of the Bean Clan's favorite routes. The two of them were in high spirits, laughing, joking, gleeful from their time at the fair. If they knew what was about to happen, they probably would have savored those last few moments together for longer. The hungry, watchful eyes of the Bean Clan were staring at them from the darkness. Just as had happened so many times before, the Sonny Bean Clan emerged from the darkness, ready to slaughter the unsuspecting couple. However, for the first time, even though the Beans had the numbers on their side, they were in for a real battle. The husband, as it turned out, was an experienced fighter, packing a sword and a gun that he used to single-handedly fend off the cannibal horde. During the bloody exchange, the wife of the couple tragically fell from the back of the horse and was gorily dismembered by the beans. Legend has it that they began tearing out her entrails and eating her alive. This, however, only galvanized the husband's Scottish fighting spirit, bringing out the William Wallace in him as he continued to valiantly fight the cannibal clan with his pistol and sword. While he probably couldn't have sustained combat for long, the noise of the brawl unfolding alerted 30 nearby villagers. They charged in with their own weapons, forcing the enraged Bean clan to retreat off into the night. For the first time since the start of this 25-year-long nightmare, their cover had been blown. Survival wasn't enough for the husband. He'd seen these animals slaughter his beloved wife. He wanted justice. He wanted revenge. That's why, as the legend goes, he traveled all the way to Glasgow to request a personal audience with King James. Some sources report it being James IV. Others report it being James VI. Point is, it was definitely a king called James. Moving on. He told the king his tale of the cave-dwelling cannibals, and the king was so horrified that he pulled together a 400-man hunting party and set out for Benin Cave himself. The days of the Sonny Bean clan were officially numbered. King James and his elite cannibal hunting squad charged into Benin Cave with a pack of ferocious hunting dogs, overwhelming the Beans with their sheer numerical force. The cave looked like a set from a grimy 1970s horror movie, filled to the brim with stolen items and half-eaten corpses. Meat was pickled in barrels, hanging from hooks, cooking over open fires. The sight was so horrifying that the Beans were immediately hauled out of the cave and dragged back into mainland Scotland, where they were executed without trial. The brutality of the enraged Scottish public almost rivaled that of the family itself. The men, women, and children of the Sonny Bean clan were alternately dismembered and buried alive. Their reign of terror was finally over, once and for all. This brings the gruesome legend of Sonny Bean and his bloodthirsty family to a close. Was any of this grounded in truth? Well, probably not. There exists no real concrete evidence to prove that Sonny or any of his or his family's crimes ever really happened. The tales of his exploits were only committed to writing hundreds of years after they supposedly happened, leaning more into frightening folklore than fact. Some contemporary scholars, such as Dr. Louise Yeoman, also attributed the figure of Sonny Bean to anti-Scottish propaganda on behalf of the English monarchy. Even the nickname Sonny was popularly used at the time as shorthand for a stereotypical violent Scot. However, even though he was probably never real, Sonny Bean's cannibal clan has since reverberated through pop culture in a massive way. In Scotland, Sonny Bean has made Benin Cave a popular tourist attraction, allowing locals to profit off of legend. The story of Sonny Bean also inspired the brutal horror novel Off Season by Jack Ketchum and Wes Craven's horror cult classic The Hills Have Eyes, about an American family being stalked by mutant cannibals in the Nevada desert. Even though Sonny Bean and his clan were, thankfully, a product of fiction, the ripples of his dark legend have the power to make us feel just a little bit queasy even today. Stefan Novak's heart beats rapidly in his chest as he approaches the Nazi checkpoint. Heavily armored SS soldiers check each person's papers before they're allowed to enter the heart of the Nazi Empire. Stefan watches in horror as a man is pulled from the line screaming. He's thrown to the ground. The man pleads with the Nazis to spare his life, that the Star of David burned into his arm was just a mistake. He really isn't Jewish. But the Nazis don't listen. The commander pulls his pistol out of its holster and shoots the man in the chest. Stefan shows no emotion as he watches the innocent man die. He knows that if he's going to successfully infiltrate the lands of the Third Reich, he needs to maintain his cover. Stefan has been working tirelessly to assume his new identity, one that will allow him to move freely across the European continent, which is now completely controlled by Adolf Hitler. Before the Nazis won the war in Europe, Stefan was a resistance fighter in the Polish army, but now there is no war to fight. The Nazis have full control of Europe, and Stefan only has one thing on his mind: to find his wife and daughter before they're worked to death in a concentration camp or executed for being related to an enemy of the Nazi state. As the war came to an end, Stefan received word from Polish underground forces that his wife and daughter had been taken by the Nazis and put on a train to work in one of the slave camps somewhere in the empire. He immediately called in all of his favors to secure fake documents and uncover as much of his information on his family's whereabouts as possible. The good news is he knows where to start his search. The bad news is that the start point is in Berlin, the heart of the Nazi Empire. Stefan reaches the front of the line. The Nazi soldier asks for his papers. He keeps his eyes on the ground as a sign of fear, even though he would be more than capable of snapping the Nazi's neck and taking out a few of his comrades in the process. But he must remain undercover if he has any hope of locating his wife and daughter. The soldier is quiet for a moment as he looks over the papers. "What business do you have in the capital?" the Nazi asks. "I wish to give my life to the Third Reich. I was a stonemason before the war. And I know the Führer is in need of hardworking men to complete his vision for Germania, Stefan replies. The Nazi grunts. Polish scum, he says. Very well, continue on. The Nazi slams Stefan's papers into his chest, slightly pushing him backward, and points to where he should go. It takes everything Stefan has not to punch the Nazi in the face, but he knows what the consequences of such an action would be. He continues through the checkpoint and boards a bus for Berlin. The bus drives through the Nazi countryside. It looks untouched by the war. The Nazis work quickly, and it's helped that they now have a gigantic pool of slave labor to pull from in order to rebuild their roads and buildings. Anyone who does not conform to Hitler's vision of the Aryan race is treated as a second-class citizen. Anyone belonging to ethnic minority groups such as the Jews are enslaved and either worked to death or killed as part of the Nazis' mass genocide program. The bus enters what was once Berlin. The city has been transformed into Hitler's megacity called Germania. Everywhere Stefan looks, he sees statues dedicated to Nazi leaders and generals. Grand buildings made of marble quarried by slaves rise from the ground like mountains. The city seems to have popped up overnight thanks to the millions of forced laborers Hitler and his architects had at their disposal. The sight of swastikas and Nazi symbols on every building and street corner makes Stefan sick. The bus comes to a stop in the heart of the city. Stefan gets off. He has instructions from one of the informants in the Polish underground network to pick up more information on the whereabouts of his family in a newly constructed housing complex. He heads there immediately and finds a small eagle representing the Polish coat of arms etched into one of the stones of the building. Stefan pushes the stone. It moves slightly to reveal a hidden compartment. In it is a set of papers that indicate his wife and daughter have been sent to the east. Early in the war, the Nazis reached an agreement with the Soviet Union, saying that they would stay out of the war in exchange for Hitler not invading their country. Hitler had no intention of upholding his end of the bargain, but he needed time to focus his efforts on defeating the Allied forces in France. Once this mission was complete, he launched Operation Sea Lion across the English Channel into Britain. The Allied forces in Britain were still recovering from the Dunkirk invasion and were no match for the Nazi blitzkrieg. Britain fell soon after. Now it's ruled by Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's top generals and good friends. Göring is a monster who has turned Britain into his own private island. He has luxury goods imported from around the empire and throws lavish parties for his Nazi comrades in what was once Buckingham Palace. Resources from Britain are sent back to Germany as tribute to Hitler, but for all intents and purposes, Göring is the new King of England. He must do exactly what the Führer orders. But in return, he has free reign of the British Isles and is quickly stripping them of their resources while oppressing their people. As soon as Hitler controlled all of Western Europe and defeated British military forces, he turned his attention toward the Soviet Union. The Nazis coordinated an attack with Japan, who struck from the west, while their forces pushed across Eastern Europe and into Russia from the opposite direction. All Hitler really wanted was the territory up to the Ural Mountains. Eventually, he would take over the world, but this would complete the first stage of his plan and put all of Europe under his control. Stefan puts the stone back in its place and heads to the train station, where he purchases a ticket for the Nazi territories in what was once the Soviet Union. When Hitler defeated the Allies in Europe, he annexed Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. Most of the populations in these regions conformed to his definition of what the human race should look like. There were resistance fighters who tried to protect the freedom of all peoples in these nations, but they were quickly disposed of by the SS. Now the Dutch and Scandinavian governments are puppets for Hitler to do with as he pleases. However, the people in the former Soviet Union aren't so lucky. Stefan looks out the window of the train car as the lands east of Germany seem more like hell than earth. The landscape has been ravaged for its resources. Hitler had no intentions of incorporating the people of the Soviet Union into his empire. All he wants to do is use them as slave labor and harvest the oil, metal, and timber from their land. Stefan feels sick to his stomach as he passes ghost town after ghost town. Buildings are in ruin from the war. People are living in houses missing entire walls. After days of traveling, the train jerks to a stop and Stefan gets off. The air is cold, but the smell of smoke fills his nose. He looks down the road and sees the fencing of a work camp where thousands of people are being held. He follows the procession of new laborers that were on board the train with him, but at the last minute ducks into a thick patch of bushes that sits on the edge of the tree line. He waits for the Nazi guards who are escorting the group to enter the camp before he starts making his way toward the fencing. Stefan peers into the camp. SS and newly conscripted Russian soldiers who are sympathetic to the Nazi cause shout out orders at the workers. Many are malnourished or are nothing but skin and bone. Anyone who's seen by the Nazis as having an inferior bloodline or belonging to an ethnic minority is used for slave labor. Unfortunately, this constitutes anyone from Russia. Stefan makes eye contact with one of the men walking toward the barracks. The man's face is covered in dirt. He can barely stand up straight from exhaustion. Stefan recognizes this man. He was a soldier in the resistance. They had conducted a few missions together. The former ally looks around to see if anyone's watching and then makes his way to the fence. "Stefan, what are you doing here?" he whispers. "I'm looking for Tony and my daughter. An informant told me they've been taken to this camp." The man's expression becomes even more somber. He shakes his head back and forth. "I'm so very sorry, Stefan," he says. "Your wife and daughter were loaded into a transport a week ago. The Nazis are diverting people to the coast of France as they plan for the attack on the United States." Stefan's heart breaks. He's silent for a moment. How were they? Had they been hurt by these Nazi bastards? "No," the man on the other side of the fence responds. "They were weak, like all of us, but they were in relatively good health when they left. I'm sorry, Stefan. I wish I had better." Suddenly, a gunshot rings out. The former resistance fighter's eyes open wide. Stefan reaches out through the fence to steady him. Blood trickles from the man's mouth as he falls to the ground. Stefan looks up. Several Nazi guards are running toward him with their guns raised. Stefan turns and sprints to the forest. He weaves through the trees, trying to put as much distance between him and the Nazi camp as possible. He hears the sounds of dogs barking and men shouting from behind him. Stefan pushes his body as far as it'll go. He knows that if he's captured, his hopes of seeing his wife and child again would be crushed. Stefan spots a tree with thick branches and abundant foliage. He darts toward it and leaps off the ground, grabbing onto one of the branches. He begins to climb higher and higher into the tree. If he can hide there until the Nazis pass, he may be able to get out of this alive. Moments later, several dogs appear. They bark and growl as they run past the tree Stefan is hiding in. He lets out a sigh of relief, but it's premature. The dogs realize they've lost his scent and backtrack toward the tree he's hiding in. They begin sniffing all around the tree. The Nazi soldiers catch up and begin looking for Stefan. He closes his eyes and prays he's not discovered. Yelling can be heard from another part of the forest. The Nazis turn their heads to listen. They give new commands to the dogs, who stop sniffing around the tree and sprint toward the sound of the shouting. The Nazi soldiers follow. Stefan stays in the tree for what feels like hours. When he finally climbs down, the sun is set and the frigid night air is quiet. He makes his way back toward the train tracks, where he waits for a transport to pass by. The sound of a locomotive can be heard off in the distance. Then a behemoth of a train comes into view. Stefan runs out of the forest as fast as he can. He times his jump perfectly and grabs onto one of the handles of the train. It takes every ounce of strength, but Stefan manages to slide the car door open and falls into the train car. It's carrying supplies toward Western Europe, where they'll be used to launch an attack across the Atlantic. The clicking and clacking of the train on the tracks is like a lullaby. Stefan doesn't know exactly where this train is headed, but he knows it's at least bringing him closer to finding his wife and child. Stefan blacks out from exhaustion. When he awakes, the train is still crossing the former Soviet Union. By the angle of the sun, it seems as if it's traveling due west, but slightly to the south. This isn't ideal, but he is relatively safe on board the train, and he knows it'll eventually make its way to the west coast to deliver the supplies. Several more days go by. Stefan survives off the stores of grain that have been packed aboard the train. Whenever it rains, he catches the precious liquid in a Nazi helmet he found in one of the crates. As the sun rises a week after he snuck aboard the train, an ominous sight comes into view. In the distance, Stefan can see gigantic snow-covered peaks jutting up from the landscape. He knows these must be the Alps. He's now in a newly formed Roman Empire. As the train travels through the countryside, Stefan sees a mix of Nazi and Italian soldiers at different checkpoints. When Hitler conquered Northern Europe and the Western Soviet Union, he allowed Mussolini to control the lands that were once under the control of the Roman Empire. However, it's clear that Mussolini is not really in control. In fact, he isn't even allowed to make his own decisions. He almost cost the Nazis the war in Southern Europe, and now Hitler uses him as a figurehead while he controls the nation. There's been recent contention between the Italian puppet government and Hitler, as the Italians try to hold on to their Roman Catholic religion. Hitler, on the other hand, wants to dismantle Christianity and organized religion completely. His tension has caused the Nazis to deploy forces around the new Roman Empire to make the transition to a state ideology go more smoothly. Hitler is adamant that the only allegiance and belief system anyone in his empire should have is to him and the Nazi Party. The train Stefan is hiding on reaches the coast of what was once southern France. He looks across the Mediterranean. On the other side of these waters is northern Africa, which is also under the control of the Nazis. Once the Allied forces in Europe were defeated, the Nazi army faced little to no resistance while invading other parts of the world. Hitler had no interest in building up infrastructure in North Africa, but he's incredibly interested in its resources, especially oil. Stefan closes his eyes and thinks about his wife and daughter. His train has now begun to travel northwest. Soon it'll reach the western coast of Hitler's empire. After the Nazis defeated Britain and the Soviet Union, Hitler turned his attention towards Spain. He appreciated what Francisco Franco was doing in the country, but there could only be one dictator in Europe, and it was going to be him. Hitler ordered his Luftwaffe to carry out bombing runs on key targets in Spain and Portugal, followed by a series of infantry invasions. Both countries quickly fell, and Franco's pleas to remain the leader of Spain fell on deaf ears. As a sign of respect for his fellow dictator, Hitler did not execute Franco but exiled him to South America instead. The Nazis immediately began constructing railways through the country all the way to the Strait of Gibraltar, where a massive fortress was created to guard the entrance to the Mediterranean. New docks were also created to allow for easy transportation of goods and natural resources from Africa onto mainland Europe. Stefan feels the train begin to slow and prepares to jump off before it reaches the station. This is no ordinary Nazi outpost. The final destination of this train is Brest, in what used to be France. It's from this region that Hitler will launch his aerial assault of the eastern United States. The Brittany Peninsula has been converted into one big airfield full of America bombers and other long-range aircraft. Stefan tucks and rolls off the train right before it crosses into a heavily guarded train yard, where the supplies aboard will be offloaded. The French countryside has been completely demolished, and in its place are factories and airfields as far as anyone can see. Trains and transports run constantly from Germany to the western coast of Europe, as the only real threat to Hitler's domination of the world is the US. Many French people have been enlisted to aid in the war effort. Their armies fell quickly after the initial invasion of the country by the Nazi panzer and infantry divisions. Stefan breaks into a nearby house to steal clothing and food before setting out to locate his wife and daughter in the various work camps in the area. He's surprised to find a Nazi SS uniform in one of the drawers, and even though the outfit goes against everything he stands for, he puts it on, as brown cloth with the swastika stitched on the arm will allow him to move freely to search for his family. A belt with a holster hangs on the back of one of the doors. In the holster is a Luger with a full clip. Stefan knows if he has to use the pistol, it'll likely be the last thing he ever does, but having a weapon might come in handy if he runs into serious trouble. The new reality of Hitler's Europe is that no matter where anyone goes, there are always concentration camps set up to provide a free source of labor. The main group of people in the camps are Eastern Europeans and prisoners of war. Hitler's empire will always need workers, so the mass extermination of people has slowed slightly. Hitler knows that with an almost unlimited amount of free manpower and resources pouring in from all of his newly acquired territories, he can make any of his sick dreams a reality. Stefan makes his way from camp to camp, careful to interact with as few Nazis as possible. Each time he enters a new area, he tries to remain calm and conduct a thorough search for his family. After days of searching, Stefan feels defeated. He knows he can't give up, but the pain and suffering he's witnessed is enough to drive him mad. The individuals in each work camp are treated more like animals than people. They're starving and overworked. He'll not give up, but with every camp he enters, he loses a little bit of himself. Stefan is about to call it a day when he sees a young girl with her back to him. She's holding on the fence, looking out across a field. Stefan slowly approaches her. "Anna?" he whispers. The girl turns around, tears streaming down her face. It is his daughter. Stefan resists the urge to wrap his arms around her so he doesn't look suspicious. "Papa?" the girl asks. Stefan's eyes begin to water. "It's me. I'm going to get you out of here, but we have to pretend we don't know each other." His daughter stares at him. She can't believe her father is really there. She squints as she looks at his Nazi uniform. Stefan understands. "It's only a disguise, my love, so that I can find you and your mother." He pauses for a moment to look around. "Anna, where is your mother?" His daughter begins to sob. "They took her," she manages to blurt out. "Mama refused to do any more work for the Nazis. She spat in one of their faces and was taken away. I think they're going to kill her." Stefan's eyes open wide. "Where did they take her?" he asked. His daughter points to the other side of the fence where she's been staring previously. Stefan can just barely make out a group of figures standing in a straight line. Clustered in front of them are several Nazis. They hold their weapons by their side, but it is clear what's about to happen. "Come with me," Stefan tells his daughter. They walk quickly toward a jeep parked outside one of the mess halls. Stefan holds his breath as he looks at the steering wheel. The keys are in the ignition. "Get in the back and cover yourself with a blanket on the seat," he says to Anna. She does as she's told. Once his daughter is safely hidden, Stefan slides into the driver's seat of the jeep and turns the key. The engine roars to life. From inside the mess hall, Stefan can hear plates clatter and voices yelling. The sound of the engine alerts the Nazis that something is wrong. He must get to his wife before she's executed or he and his daughter are captured. Stefan floors the jeep and speeds toward the gate. The crack of gunshots ring out behind him as the Nazis flood out of the mess hall and open fire. The guards at the gate raise their machine guns and shoot at the incoming vehicle. Stefan unholsters the Luger he stole and returns fire. He holds his breath to steady his aim and focuses. His resistance training immediately kicks in. He buries around in the chest of one of the guards and sends the second diving for cover. Stefan pushes the accelerator down so hard he feels as if his foot might go through the floor of the Jeep. The vehicle slams through the gate and veers down the dirt road. Stefan turns the wheel hard and steers toward the row of prisoners who are about to be executed in the field. The Nazi guards watch the incoming Jeep, unsure of what's going on. Then they see their comrades in pursuit from the work camp. Before they can raise their guns to the Jeep, it's upon him. Stefan hits several of the Nazi soldiers as he skids to a stop, sending the men flying through the air. There are now only 2 soldiers remaining. They unleash a barrage of bullets into the side of the Jeep. Stefan rolls out onto the ground. He pops up from behind the door and returns fire. He hits one of the Nazis in the stomach. The man falls to the ground. Stefan turns the pistol on the second Nazi and pulls the trigger, but instead of firing, there's only a click. The gun is jammed. Stefan ducks back behind the Jeep just as the Nazis open fire again. The bullets ricochet off the metal frame of the vehicle. Stefan crawls to the side of the Jeep. He waits for the Nazi to run out of bullets. When the firing ceases, Stefan hears the soldier begin to reload. He sprints out from behind the vehicle and runs straight to the enemy. He tackles the man to the ground, punching him as hard as he can in the face. His fist connects with the Nazi's nose, shattering it and knocking the soldier out. Stefan pants as he regains control of his body and slows his heartbeat. Then he hears a familiar voice. "Stefan, is that you?" He looks up to see his wife. She has a shocked look on her face, but when their eyes meet, she smiles and places a hand gently on his cheek. "I knew you'd come," she says. Stefan stands and embraces her for a moment. The shouts of the Nazi soldiers running toward them breaks the joyful moment and brings them back to reality. "Come on," Stefan says, signaling to the Jeep. Stefan, his wife, and the other prisoners who were to be executed pile into the vehicle. Anna hugs her mother. The Jeep drives away, leaving the Nazis in the dust. Stefan and the escapees have a long way to go to get out of Nazi-controlled Europe, but he's now reunited with his family, and he'll do anything to make sure they get to safety. For centuries, Europe has been a global military juggernaut, and throughout the 15th and 20th centuries, its armies and navies have dominated the world. Yet after 2 disastrous world wars, the European powers saw their former empires collapse, and along with them much of their global clout. Today, Europe remains amongst the preeminent military powers, but no European nation can even come close to matching their former might. Today, we're going to take a look at the top 10 military powers in Europe and figure out who is still top dog and who's at the bottom of the pack. Number 10. Czechia. Czechia, or the Czech Republic, was one of the first nations to throw off the yoke of the Soviet Union. Through the peaceful Velvet Revolution, Czechoslovakia overthrew communism and once more became a liberal democracy in November 1989. 4 years later, the nation would split into 2 countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and by 2006, the Czech Republic was recognized by the World Bank as a developed country. A small nation, Czechia's military is split into the Czech Land Forces and Czech Air Force, with smaller specialized units falling somewhere in between the two. In 1999, Czechia became part of NATO, and its soldiers have seen combat in Afghanistan, Mali, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, Egypt, Israel, and Somalia. After ending compulsory service in 2004, Czechia has focused on a modernization initiative that sees it replacing all of its former Soviet-era equipment, and by 2027 should see it field a completely modernized force. Today, Czechia's military stands at 25,000 active-duty personnel and have an Air Force strength of 100 aircraft, to include 12 fighters and 28 attack aircraft. While small in number, its Air Force can count on the JAS-39 Gripen multi-role fighter, an extremely capable aircraft manufactured by Sweden. On the ground, Czechia fields 116 tanks and 437 armored fighting vehicles, supported by 86 self-propelled artillery and 85 towed artillery. Unfortunately, Czechia's tank forces are made up exclusively of Soviet-built T-72s. And as part of a $4.5 billion modernization initiative, the Czech Republic is looking at various tank models, to include the German Leopard and the American Abrams to replace its aging fleet. A lack of multiple launch rocket systems, however, leaves Czech ground forces vulnerable in either offensive or defensive operations, as MLRSs are capable of pumping out a huge volume of fire in a very short time, compared to traditional artillery, which limits how much time enemy units have to get under cover. Small but formidable, Czechia currently takes the number 10 spot in the top 10 European powers. Number 9. Ukraine. Despite a civil war lasting since 2014, Ukraine still tops the list of top European military powers and comes in at the number 9 spot. Currently, Ukrainian military forces number at 1.2 million, with 205,000 active duty forces and 1 million reservists, whom have been continuously rotated in and out of active duty since the start of hostilities against the separatist forces of Donetsk and Luhansk. Facing off against an insurgency that is financially and materially backed up by Russia, Ukraine military forces have been facing an onslaught of modern Russian-made equipment for half a decade, forcing the government to reinvigorate its defense spending. At the end of the conflict, Ukraine's military was in shambles, having sold off most of its Soviet-era military equipment without replacing it, and with a military that was poorly trained and with extremely poor morale. With the aid of the American and NATO military advisors, though, Ukraine's army has slowly been shaping up into a professional military force. The United States in particular have been providing large amounts of aid to Ukraine in the forms of military hardware, providing them with hundreds of anti-tank and surface-to-air missile systems. Against the rebel forces, however, these are largely useless, and the rebels do not operate tanks nor have an air force. But the stockpile of modern anti-tank and anti-air missile systems has ensured that Ukraine could exact a very heavy toll on Russia should it choose to interfere again. With a limited budget, Ukraine is nonetheless looking to modernize its 800 Soviet-era BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicles and has a domestic modernization program to evolve the Soviet-made BMP-1. While operating aging T-84 and T-80 main battle tanks, Ukraine has little reason to seek an upgrade to its tank fleet, as the urban nature of their conflict against the Russian-backed separatists does not favor the use of battle tanks. Believed to be weak by Russia when it backed separatist forces in 2014, Ukraine has nonetheless proven that it has a resilient military, and with the aid of the United States and other NATO nations, looks set to become a very experienced and professional force that will give Russia second thoughts about attempting to force the nation back into its Soviet-era sphere of influence. Number 8. Greece. Greece is one of NATO's most important military powers, the nation's location along the Mediterranean making it a strategic linchpin in controlling naval activities in the region. While currently undergoing serious economic troubles, Greece nonetheless is one of the few NATO allies who is currently meeting the alliance's commitment for all nations to fund their militaries at a level of at least 2% of GDP. Greece is also one of the United States' closest allies, with their military force partaking in countless exercises together and operating side by side everywhere from Kosovo to Afghanistan and Iraq. Currently, the Greek military numbers at 360,500, with 140,000 active-duty personnel and 220,500 reservists. Unfortunately, Greece continues the practice of compulsory military service, which results in low personnel retention rates and low morale overall. Ranked as the 20th most powerful air force in the world, Greece fields a total of 187 fighters, 187 attack aircraft, and 29 attack helicopters. Most of its air force is made up of American-made F-16s, and recently Greece signed an agreement with the US to modernize its fleet of F-16s with modern electronics and upgraded radar. Currently mulling purchases of the F-35, Greece is looking to balance a need to field a modern military with its current economic situation. Number 7. Poland. Poland is no stranger to conflict and has historically been the battleground for any war between Western and Eastern European powers. Today, though, Poland is keenly aware of its vulnerability to Russian aggression thanks to the Suwalki Gap, a 65-mile-wide strip of territory that links Lithuania and the Baltic NATO allies with the rest of the alliance. Thought of as the modern Fulda Gap, a strip of territory in Germany where NATO expected mass Soviet forces to stream through and into Western Europe, Poland has taken its defensive commitments to the alliance quite seriously, and today is one of the few members to meet or exceed the 2% of GDP spending goal. Today, Poland fields a military of 105,000 active-duty personnel, with a military geared at slowing down and delaying a Russian advance into Western Europe. A lifeline between the rest of NATO and the Baltics, Poland understands all too well that it'll be the most strategically important battleground in any conflict against Russia. Thus, Poland has engaged in an aggressive modernization program, with aims to replace its aging and very troubled fleet of MiG-29s with fifth-generation fighters, likely the F-35. The Polish military has also prioritized the acquisition of anti-air missile systems and signed a multi-billion-dollar contract with U.S. defense manufacturer Raytheon to supply it with the Patriot missile system. With big acquisitions in new submarines, short-range anti-air missiles, and a new main battle tank, Poland is set to become one of NATO's most important military allies. Number 6. Spain. Once threatening to wipe out England's independence, Spain's days as a global superpower are far in the past. Yet today it remains one of the most formidable militaries in the world. Spain's military numbers at 139,500, with 124,000 active duty personnel and 15,500 reservists. Despite its small numbers though, Spain overwhelmingly fields modern military equipment and maintains one of Europe's most formidable navies. Its air force is equipped with modern Eurofighters and American-made F-18 Hornets, which also operate from its one active aircraft carrier. Despite intense pressure from the rest of Europe, Spain is also looking to possibly acquire the F-35 over European-made alternatives. With 327 Leopard 2 and Leopard 2E tanks, Spain's ground forces are certainly to be feared, though its relative lack of attack helicopters would leave the bulk of anti-armor operations to its infantry and armored forces. Despite its military strength though, Spain has been increasingly criticized by other NATO allies for actually decreasing spending on its military relative to its GDP, falling from 1.23% of GDP in 2014 to 0.93% of GDP in 2018. Spain's economic booms have not been reflected in its military expenditures, a fact that the US in particular has been very quick to point out. Number 5. Italy. Italy finds itself struggling to hold on to its number 5 spot as it faces economic turmoil in a government that seems to have no clear vision on the future of its armed forces. Plagued for years by a lack of planning, legislature meant to ensure that the military funding is set in advance and binding for at minimum 3-year periods failed to be passed, and thus the Italian military finds itself in the same economic lurch that's been in for nearly a decade. Currently, Italy fails to meet its 2% of GDP spending requirement by a wide margin, and the figure continues to decrease. To make matters worse, the defense budget is set on a yearly basis, with predicted future figures for the following years, which are in no way binding. This makes the acquisition of big-ticket items such as new fighters, tanks, and other expensive weapon systems all but impossible. Despite budget woes, Italy is still considered the preeminent Mediterranean naval power, and its fleet of 5 aircraft carriers, 12 frigates, 4 destroyers, and 8 submarines ensure that NATO interests are very safely guarded in the Mediterranean. Its air force is also considerable, with 94 fighters, 182 attack aircraft, and 59 attack helicopters. As a partner in the F-35 program, Italy will soon be upgrading its combat aircraft with the F-35 Lightning II, though it will retain a sizable fleet of Eurofighter Typhoons. Number 4. Germany. After 2 disastrous world wars, Germany drastically scaled back its military ambitions. Though during the Cold War, the West German Bundeswehr was an extremely capable and well-equipped force. Immediately after reunification, its military forces were cut back to the bare minimum. Where once Germany was a military juggernaut that threatened world domination twice, today Germany is a much more reserved military power, which has purposefully made it a point to limit its ability to operate in an expeditionary manner. Focused more on defense of itself and Europe, Germany today fields a military of 208,641, with 178,641 active duty personnel and 30,000 reservists. The German Air Force is particularly troubled. Though it fields very capable aircraft, it is crippled with logistical issues and a shortage of pilots. A recent internal study found that German air forces could not be reliably called upon to join an ongoing NATO operation in the case of Russian aggression. Similar problems plague the German Navy, and though its defense industry creates some of the most capable conventional submarines in the world, its own fleet is also experiencing logistical difficulties, mostly due to bureaucratic problems. On the ground, however, Germany operates hundreds of Leopard 2 tanks, widely considered one of, if not the best battle tank in the world. Number 3. Great Britain. It was once said that the sun never set on the British Empire, thanks to the vast amounts of territory it held all around the world. Sadly, after the Second World War, British military might waxed precipitously. And though it remains a formidable military power, it's also an extremely fragile one. That is thanks in large part to the fact that the once legendary British military-industrial complex is but a sliver of its former self, and today Britain must partner either with the US or other European allies in order to develop and procure new military hardware. For centuries considered the greatest of naval powers, today Britain must seek the help of the US in order to build its new Astute-class submarines. Despite its troubles, though, Britain remains a formidable military power, though it has recently slipped from the second most powerful military in Europe to third. Its air forces are in great shape, and the RAF will soon be flying the F-35. On the ground, Britain continues to operate the Challenger 2 main battle tank, without a doubt the best defended battle tank in the world, And where its defense industry has atrophied severely, Britain nonetheless continues to develop some of the most advanced vehicle armor plating materials in the world. Unfortunately, the once mighty British Navy is but a ghost of its former self, and its fleet of 19 surface combat ships is routinely forced to mothball individual vessels for months at a time due to a lack of personnel. To make matters worse, the launching of 2 new Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers are threatening to cannibalize the rest of their surface fleet due to the expense of the vessels. Number 2. France. Power in Europe has traditionally swung back and forth between France and Great Britain, but today that pendulum is firmly in France's favor. While the British defense industry has atrophied and largely wasted away, France maintains a very strong and independent military-industrial base. Its defense companies produce some of the world's best fighter aircraft, submarines, and tanks. Most notably, while Britain depends on the US to develop and maintain its nuclear arsenal, France has a completely independent air and land-based nuclear deterrent using French missiles with French warheads. While Britain's Navy finds itself in increasingly perilous waters, the French Navy has in recent years become the dominant naval force in Europe, with a very strong expeditionary capability that allows it to operate far from friendly shores. Its forces include 1 nuclear carrier with 3 conventional smaller carriers, 11 frigates, 12 destroyers, and 10 submarines. In the air, the French Air Force operates 273 fighter and strike aircraft, along with 56 attack helicopters, and all modern and extremely capable models. On the ground, France operates 406 main battle tanks and a fleet of 6,300 armored fighting vehicles that give its infantry incredible mobility and protection in a modern battlefield. With an eye to the future, France recently established a red team of science fiction writers whose job is to hypothesize future war scenarios that the French military may one day face, proving that the French military is set to dominate Europe not just today but well into the future. Number 1. Russia. Russia once operated the largest military force in the world, with hordes of tanks and armored vehicles so vast that NATO military planners feared that war with the Soviet Union would be unwinnable without the use of tactical nuclear weapons. For decades, the Soviet military-industrial complex delivered cutting-edge military technologies, and just years before the end of the Cold War, a CIA study showed that though at the time the US led the Soviet Union in total areas of scientific superiority, the Soviet Union would not just catch up but exceed the US within a decade. Sadly, the mighty military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union collapsed into ashes after the dissolution of the communist regime. Despite this, Russia continues to develop cutting-edge military technologies, proving that its scientists are still among the world's best. Though unfortunately many times those breakthrough military technologies are left on the drawing board due to budget woes. Russia's legendary 5th-generation Sukhoi Su-57 is one such example, with development on the fighter officially postponed indefinitely due to an inability to finance its procurement. The T-14 Armata tank is another casualty of Russia's budget shortfalls, and despite being widely considered the world's first true next-generation tank, planned purchases of 2,000 by 2020 fell to just 100. And then to the complete cancellation of the main production run. Despite its budget woes, Russia maintains the second most formidable military in the world. Plagued by the embarrassingly poor performance of its forces against Chechen rebels and Georgian military forces in 2006, Russia has proven that it has overcome strategic and operational shortcomings in the years since. Today, Russia may be a much maligned state due to its actions on the world stage, but none doubt that it still packs a considerable punch, which no nation, including the US, is eager to test. Before we start, we shouldn't have to tell you that not all people in the United States of America do the same things, like the same things, or act the same way. But sometimes we can generalize because certain cultures do seem to have certain traits. The English, for instance, for the most part do seem to go on about the weather quite a lot. Maybe they do that sometimes while sipping on tea. Is that generalization true? Yes, you can find data on how much tea is drunk in England, and data about how much folks there natter about the vagaries of the troposphere. That said, feel free to scream at us in the comments if you think we've got the good old USA wrong. First of all, let's just recap a little on what we said in our first show about what those Europeans find weird about the US. We first mentioned the tipping culture, as Americans seem to tip more than most people in Europe. We also mentioned the very large meals often served in a restaurant, which might look like meals for 3 for some Europeans. On the bright side, we also told you that Americans can be very friendly and smile a lot, but Europeans might also express shock when they get ID'd for trying to buy smokes or booze. As for the rest, the block system, using credit cards everywhere, too many commercial breaks on TV, dubious wrestling, 24-hour cities, hyper-devout Christians, flags everywhere, guns everywhere, and the fact that everything seems just, well, big. We mentioned the show because we actually asked you in the comments what you, our European viewers, found weird about the USA. One of the top answers was the fact that in the US, you have to pay for your healthcare. As we've said in our other shows, the US healthcare system costs the taxpayers an incredible amount of money. It's the most expensive in the world, yet rated poorly. If you can't afford to get insured or have insurance that doesn't cover the whole cost, as has been reported time and time again in the US media, getting sick here can and does bankrupt many families. It's expensive because drugs are costly and you have defensive costs, meaning doctors are afraid to get sued, so do many tests. Then you have ultra-expensive admin and ultra-expensive treatments. But the real reason is why most European nations have less expensive healthcare is that governments oversee healthcare, while America is more focused on having healthcare as a business, not a God-given right to each citizen. As Forbes wrote in 2017, it's because ultimately the US healthcare system wasn't designed with consumer needs in mind. It was built to maximize the insurance billing process. This is what Europeans find weird, because most of them see healthcare as something everyone should be entitled to. We'll stick with the negative for now, and something another of our European viewers said he thought was weird. He wrote, "An American thing that I find weird is that schools are sometimes confused with shooting ranges. Does the US really have so many more school shootings than countries in Europe? You can find data on this, timelines of global school shootings, and indeed, America doesn't just have more than European countries, but it's hard to find any instances of this happening in Europe." CNN published a piece in 2018 about school shootings around the world since 2009. Here are the numbers: UK 0, Italy 0, Germany 1, Greece 1, Russia 1, Turkey 1, France 2, USA 288. The next country, not in Europe, but with the highest number was Mexico, with 6. If you find this weird, you might look to the USA's Second Amendment and the right to bear arms. As we mentioned in the first show, there are a lot of guns around in the USA. Americans cherish their freedom, and many people feel it's their God-given right to have a gun, but perhaps not free healthcare. The reason, according to some, is not just a legal matter, but the idea that the USA promotes something called expressive individualism. And perhaps that's one reason people might feel they can take the law into their own hands. But we can't go into details about this as the debate is a long one. What we can say is the fact that kids get shot up in classrooms so often in the USA is a thing that Europeans find, well, crazy. Another thing that one of our viewers mentioned was the drinking laws in the USA. Maybe you can get a hold of a gun, but you aren't even allowed to drink. Maybe you can risk your life in battle, but you can't get served a shot of scotch in a bar. As one person wrote, 21 WTF. Why does the US have such strict drinking laws? If you go over to Europe, you'll find youngsters downing beers and wine with abandon, but also drinking responsibly at times. As one writer in the US says, "Isn't it weird that you're considered an adult when you're 18 but can't legally buy booze until you're 21? There's a long and storied history about alcohol in America and why the legal drinking age is set at 21, said that writer. We're told that certain states had different laws on when you can buy booze, and this kept changing in the 20th century. For a long time, the legal age was 18. One doctor writes, "None of this had any medical or psychological basis, but had to do with rights and responsibilities afforded to people defined as adults." He said it was generally considered that if at age 18, you could be sent to fight in a war, you could darn well be responsible enough to drink. But all that changed when they put the age up to 21 in 1984. It said while 18-year-old people could fight in a war, they were still doing things like crashing cars while loaded. It was also thought that if the drinking age was made a little higher, fewer 19 to 20-year-olds would drink. And what happened was when one state had a younger drinking age law than another, is kids would travel to drink. And this caused even more mayhem when they crashed cars. Basically, much of the public said make a law of 21 for everyone. Does it work? The CDC reported that in one survey that interviewed high schoolers in the USA, found 30% drank some amount of alcohol, 14% binge drank, 6% drove after drinking alcohol, 17% rode with a driver who'd been drinking alcohol. Still, you can find data on teen drinking around the world, and it seems Europe has more problems with it than the USA. Well, certainly in Eastern Europe. Other studies show us USA teens binge drink at a similar rate to Western European teens. Whatever the case, most people still think the 21 age limit is pretty weird. Okay, so what about the fact that the USA doesn't use the metric system? It doesn't even seem like a rational way of measuring things. Why does the US not change? We found a good answer in Time magazine that wrote a piece called "Why Won't America Go Metric?" Time writes that the popular narrative holds that this 1970s conversion movement failed and that Americans have never gone metric because we're too obstinate or patriotic or just plain stupid to do so. This tale is wrong. The article states that America is metric, but only in the background. It uses the system for many measurements, but the fact is the public doesn't want to change fully because people know the other system well. When the metric system was developed in France in the 18th century, it just seemed too radical, and Thomas Jefferson said, "Take your system and shove it up your European nether regions." Changing would mean having to change many things about the infrastructure of the country. Most Europeans didn't agree though, and they adopted the system. Even what Time calls the world's most anti-metric nation, Great Britain, finally ditched the imperial system in the 1970s for better access to European markets. The world then caught on for the same reason, the global economy. Time proudly exclaims that the USA learned both systems. That ours is a dual measurement country is part of our great diversity, the article concludes. Okay, so what about this Fahrenheit thing? Surely Celsius just makes more sense. As one source writes, Celsius is a reasonable scale that assigns freezing and boiling points of water with round numbers, 0 and 100. Then you have Fahrenheit with 32 to 212. Very few countries use this measurement, although some older folks might still use it in places like the UK and Canada. If you read the news now though, it's mostly Celsius. So why does the USA stay with Fahrenheit? It's a long story, but most countries saw the metric system and Celsius as simple and useful. That's when most countries flipped. But the British and its colonies and former colonies held on for a long time, as you know. The systems were not only intuitive, but it seemed only right to have the same global system, as that would make cooperation much easier. But even though Congress and the US passed the 1975 Metric Conversion Act, it just didn't go down well in this proud country. The problem was the law was voluntary, and many people just didn't want to learn the metric system and figure out Celsius at the same time. Fahrenheit stuck, even though there are many critics in the USA that say it's time to change. Critics on the other side say the Fahrenheit scale is better because a 1-degree change is what a person naturally feels. As AccuWeather points out though, many Americans misjudge weather conditions in other countries because they can't understand Celsius. Maybe this is just down to pride again, but this time it's perhaps weirder and you Europeans might have a point. Okay, down to money matters. You might have heard of Europeans traveling to the USA and not being able to get on top of the bill situation. They say all the bills look the same. Most of the rest of the world has really pretty, colorful bills, and bills you can easily tell apart. So what's up with the monochrome cash? Well, first of all, it's still the world's dominant currency, so we don't expect it to change from that green-gray color scheme. The origin of green boils down to a patent of the ink and the American Banknote Company being formed in 1858. This green ink printing method was hard, virtually impossible to counterfeit, and it stuck. It's also said that green symbolized stability and growth, and that's a good thing for money. Greenbacks have become iconic, so we doubt fancy bills will be coming anytime soon. Let's finish on something much lighter, and that is American sports games replete with those people called cheerleaders. Yes, cheerleading at a serious sports game is a bit weird for Europeans. Imagine beginning the next Champions League final with dancing girls and pom-poms. The fans would only find it an irritating aside to the match. But in the US, cheerleading is accepted, enjoyed, and as one journalist said, it's down to Americans wanting their sports game to be fun and friendly a day out, unlike those soccer games that are sometimes less than pleasant, for the fans at least. You'll find cheerleading of course in other nations, but it's said all-star cheerleaders in the US number around 1.5 million. It all started in the late 1800s, but it was just a bunch of men shouting "Hoorah! Hoorah!" Someone had the idea to form teams of these cheering people, but it wasn't until men were drafted to war in the 1940s and more women turned up at sports games that they took over the cheerleading. That made it more feminine too, adding the dancing spirit to the shouting. It got serious in the 50s and has been since. Like many other things in the USA, it never took off around the globe. Those Europeans just watch and wonder what is actually going on. He was the man who established the first French Empire. To the French people, he was a hero. To the French royalty, he was their demise. Napoleon Bonaparte was a scourge to European leaders, but the countries he conquered joined a vast empire, spanning from Spain to Russia. Along with his control over Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte conquered territories in the West Indies, Americas, and North Africa. Napoleon may have been the greatest conqueror history has ever seen. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769, on Corsica, an island in the Mediterranean Sea. Just before his birth, the island of Corsica was conquered by French forces, making baby Napoleon and his family subjects of King Louis XV. At the age of 9, Napoleon joined a military school in France. He excelled in math and history, and after 7 years he received a commission as an officer in the artillery division of the French army. Then in the summer of 1789, the French Revolution began as Parisian mobs stormed the Bastille. The French Revolution concluded with the removal of the monarchy. The country was relabeled as a republic, to be governed by an assembly known as the Convention. Louis XVI was guillotined in 1793, and the French monarchy died with him. With the dismantling of the monarchy and aristocracy, France was thrown into what became known as the Reign of Terror. It's estimated that around 300,000 suspects were arrested and 17,000 people were executed during this time. It's during this tumultuous period that Napoleon began to gain fame. His first major victory came when he defeated royalist forces supported by the British Navy at the port of Toulon. After the battle, he was celebrated as a war hero. In 1795, Napoleon gained even more fame when he fired upon royalists and defeated anti-republic forces that threatened the new government. His battles against the forces that opposed the new republic gained him favor with the leaders in the new government. Young General Bonaparte was appointed commander-in-chief of the French military, a turn of events eerily similar to the rise of power of Emperor Palpatine in Star Wars. It was 7 days later when Napoleon married his first wife, Josephine de Beauharnais, although they would later be divorced because she did not birth a male heir for Napoleon. With his new power and prestige bestowed upon him by the French government, Napoleon Bonaparte began his military conquest of the region. He started by defeating Austrian forces and forcing Philip von Cobenzl to sign the Treaty of Cambo in 1797, which gave France control over the majority of the Austrian nation. By 1799, Napoleon had acquired vast new territories for France and Europe. He shifted his focus to Egypt, where he hoped to dominate the eastern Mediterranean and disrupt British control of India. During this campaign, French soldiers discovered the Rosetta Stone by accident. The Rosetta Stone was brought to Europe and eventually translated, unlocking the mysteries of Egyptian hieroglyphics. Upon returning to France in 1799, Napoleon began to create a plan to overthrow the French government. This plot would come to be known as the coup d'etat of 18 Brumaire. Napoleon succeeded in dismantling the current governing body and set up a new government called the Consulate, with himself as first consul. Napoleon had now conquered Eastern Europe and the French government. By now, Napoleon had been first consul for almost a year, and this time he had instituted many popular reforms, such as free secondary education and creating the Bank of France to improve the stability of the empire. On December 24, 1800, though, Georges Cadoudal led monarchist rebels in an attempt to assassinate Napoleon Bonaparte with a homemade bomb. The assassination was planned to kill Bonaparte while he was at the opera, as Napoleon sat in the Theatre of the Republic and the Arts in Paris, watching the premiere of The Creation by Joseph Haydn. An explosion erupted outside the building. The assassination plot had failed and would be called the Infernal Machine plot. It ended with the death of several people outside the theater but left Napoleon unharmed. This marked the first time that a bomb had been used for an assassination attempt, and it was during this period in world history that the word terrorism was first used in its current form. The term became synonymous with acts that attempted to dismantle or destroy a leader or ideology. After gaining almost absolute power and surviving more than one attempt on his life, Napoleon set his sights on conquest once again. In 1802, Napoleon sent French forces to the West Indies to secure and protect France's interests in the region. He had decided that it was time for an empire in the Americas and began to assert dominance in the New World. He was mildly successful, but before Napoleon could make his American empire a reality, he had a realization. His navy was not powerful enough to defeat the British. France suffered several defeats at the hands of the ships of the rival nation. Napoleon decided to consolidate his military and sold the Louisiana Territory to the United States, which would come to be known as the Louisiana Purchase. In return for the land, Napoleon received money that France badly needed. In 1804, the consulate was transformed into an empire, and Napoleon was officially named Emperor of the First French Empire. The following year, what was left of Austria and Russia allied themselves with the British. Napoleon decided it was time to bring the rest of Europe to their knees and began plans to invade England. But in a major defeat at the Battle of Trafalgar, the British naval fleet commanded by Admiral Nelson destroyed the French navy and ended Napoleon's plans to invade England. Realizing that the British Navy was again too powerful, Napoleon turned his attention to conquering Russia and the Holy Roman Empire. In 1805, French forces defeated Tsar Alexander I of Russia and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II at the Battle of Austerlitz. This eventually led to Tsar Alexander I signing a treaty with Napoleon and giving Napoleon control of all of Eastern Europe. There was a time of relative peace in the First French Empire until 1812, when Russia withdrew from the treaty and once again allied itself with Britain. Napoleon made the decision that Russia must be invaded and completely conquered if he was going to maintain control of the region. The invasion led to the bloodiest battles of the Napoleonic Wars. The Battle of Borodino was fought just outside of Moscow. The Russian forces were estimated to have suffered around 45,000 casualties, while the French lost approximately 30,000 men. Although both sides took great losses, Tsar Alexander I refused to surrender, and Napoleon refused to abandon his conquest. But then the Russian winter did what the Russian army could not. Due to lack of supplies and resources, the French army was forced to retreat from the bitter Russian winter, and Napoleon returned to Paris. In 1813, the combined forces of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden defeated Napoleon's armies in Europe. This forced Napoleon to abdicate his throne on April 11, 1814. The European leaders decided to banish Napoleon to the Mediterranean island of Elba. However, due to his craftiness and help from loyal supporters, Napoleon escaped captivity and returned to France in 1815. He reclaimed the throne in what was known as the 100 Days. After returning to France, Napoleon re-established his power and began his conquest once again. He swept across Europe, meeting British forces and their allies at the Battle of Waterloo. The British commander, the Duke of Wellington, decided to wait for Napoleon to attack rather than use precious men and resources in an advancing assault. Napoleon's desire for conquest pushed him to take the offensive. He sent his forces into battle. At first, Napoleon was largely successful using infantry and cavalry charges. His men were disciplined and believed in their leader. Wellington and his generals were confident that the battle was going to be lost due to the unrelenting French attacks. However, in a stroke of lucky timing, Prussian forces joined the British army and helped them repel the French advances. Napoleon decided to use his Imperial Guard, the force always reserved to decide battles, to end the war. But due to a miscalculation, Napoleon split his Imperial Guard instead of sending them into battle together. This led to both smaller forces being defeated and a retreat by the French army. The Battle of Waterloo made Great Britain the dominant global power for the next 100 years. After Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, the leaders of Europe decided he needed to be sent further away. Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to St. Helena, a remote volcanic island in the South Atlantic Ocean. The British kept 2 Navy frigates on patrol of the island at all times to ensure that Napoleon stayed in exile. Napoleon eventually died of cancer on May 5, 1821 on St. Helena at the age of 51. He was originally buried under 3 stone slabs beneath 2 willow trees, but later his body was moved back to France, where it remains to this day. Due to Napoleon's fame, he became a legend. As with all legends, incredible stories were told and myths created about the man. Conspiracy theories that Napoleon was poisoned instead of dying from natural causes spread like wildfire. People believe that his remains were stolen on the way back to Europe and secretly buried at an undisclosed location in Paris. You probably heard the claim that Napoleon was extremely short. This was actually one of the myths that came out of the Napoleonic legends. It was true that Napoleon was called Le Petit Caporal, or the Little Corporal, but this name had nothing to do with his height. Instead, his men used it as a term of endearment. It was said that when Napoleon died, he was 5 feet 2 inches tall, 2 inches shorter than Kevin Hart. However, it's been determined that the measurement provided was in French inches, which at the time were longer than English inches. When the measurement is converted, Napoleon was closer to 5 feet 6 inches tall, making him 2 inches taller than Kevin Hart. Sorry, Kevin. This means that Napoleon was actually average height for a male in Europe at the time he was alive. Was Napoleon the greatest conqueror ever? His military, political, and social accomplishments were impressive, and some still exist today. He survived several assassination attempts and escaped exile only to return to Europe and very nearly take back his empire. Regardless of his height or legends, Napoleon Bonaparte was most assuredly a force to be reckoned with in the 18th and 19th centuries. He conquered vast amounts of land around Europe, controlled several territories overseas, and marched deep into Russia. Europe had not been unified under one ruler since the Roman Empire, and Napoleon Bonaparte was the first conqueror to succeed in creating an empire in Europe and abroad where so many before him had failed, even if only briefly. During the Cold War, Russia and its satellite states formed the mighty Eastern Bloc, a powerful force that many feared would take over the world. But if these stories are any indication, the deadliest enemy of Eastern Europeans may be themselves. These are some of the dumbest ways people in Eastern Europe have ever died. Geocaching is an exciting hobby, using GPS to search for packages that have been left in obscure locations around the world. But it takes awareness of your surroundings to play safely, something a group of 4 in the Czech Republic lacked in 2018. It was a raging rainstorm outside, with floodwaters draining into the underground. But the app pointed the group to an underground tunnel in the Prague sewers where the water was draining. Undeterred, the group descended into the dark, dirty tunnel and were hit by torrential waters. While 2 were able to get to safety, one young woman was swept into the Vltava River where she was found drowned, and another man was missing in action. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, something this next man should have heeded. In the Russian city of Khabarovsk, drama was brewing. A man had just discovered that his wife was cheating on him, and he went to confront her lover. Angry words were exchanged, and the jilted man issued violent threats. But no one took them seriously, until the next day, when the angry man returned to the apartment of his wife's lover. He brought bomb-making equipment with him and attempted to rig a bomb to explode when his rival exited. But he wasn't a professional bomb maker, and while he had mastered the explosion, timing was a work in progress. The bomb blew up in his face, ending the love rivalry permanently. When using technology, make sure you understand it, or you just might find yourself sleeping with the fishes. The Terrorized River in Kiev, Ukraine is a popular fishing spot, but for those looking to make a living for their catch, they need to find ways to be more efficient. Using a line wasn't doing it for one fisherman, so he hooked up a unique contraption. He connected cables to his home's power supply and dropped the other end of the river. This created a powerful electric shock that killed countless fish and sent them floating to the surface. He reached in to collect his catch and forgot to disconnect the power, hitting himself with a massive electric shock that killed him instantly and probably scared off some cats that smelled the cooked fish. Sometimes in the battle of man versus animals, the animals win one. In Hungary, Christmas has a bloody tradition, parties where people slaughter pigs that will become part of Christmas dinner. Of course, pigs are big animals and surprisingly fast, so it's important to stun them first, if you have the right equipment. At a party in the village of Darvash Pusta, a visiting man from Croatia decided to try his luck with a homemade pig stunner and proceeded to shock himself to death, causing a fatal heart attack. When another man tried to unplug the device, he put himself in the hospital as well. And when the pig's owner saw this horrible scene, he suffered a fatal heart attack. 2 deaths, and none of them was the pig. Sometimes just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. It was 2017 when an unknown welder put himself in the history books the worst way. He worked for a highway division in Russia and was working with some decommissioned military equipment. He noticed that the mouth of an artillery howitzer was just wide enough to fit a fire extinguisher in the barrel. Naturally, there was only one thing to do. Not satisfied with the buzzworthy picture, he proceeded to load the cannon with calcium carbide and water, and the fire extinguisher proceeded to explode, sending shrapnel all around the room. The welder was hit by debris and was killed instantly, no doubt saving him from quick termination of another sort. Even if you believe you can do something, maybe you shouldn't test it. In the latter days of the Soviet Union, there was a small cottage industry of mentalists, psychics, and healers who claimed to have supernatural powers. One of the most renowned was E. Frankel, whose specialty was telekinesis. He claimed to be able to stop cars, bikes, and even streetcars in their tracks. There was just one problem with that. All those have brakes, and you don't need psychic powers to stop them, just some good timing on the driver's part. So he decided to try a bigger stunt, stopping an entire train. He stepped onto a train track, raised his hands, and tried to use his psychic powers to stop it in its tracks. The engineer slammed on the brakes, and the train did successfully stop. A few feet too late for the unfortunate Mr. Frankel, whose psychic powers had met their match. They say hands-on learning is the best way, but one biology teacher took that too far. Lydia Sekova was a teacher in Sofia, Bulgaria, and she had a dangerous hobby. In chemistry, she liked to perform volatile experiments with the help of her husband and friend, and now they had decided to take it to the public square. Bystanders watched as they dashed from their car, ran to a nearby manhole where they started pouring unknown chemicals into the drain. The chemicals were highly flammable and caused the manhole to explode, sending the manhole cover directly into the head of the unfortunate Miss Sekova, decapitating her. Her two partners in crime suffered serious face and eye injuries, but no one's quite sure what possessed them to start pouring chemicals into a sewer. But some chemical experiments are more disastrous than others. Few things are more painful to the young child than the loss of a grandmother, and when young Sergei's grandmother was ill, the Russian boy vowed to unlock the secret of immortality for her. This led him to a bizarre obsession, ingesting small quantities of poison to strengthen his body. He tested toxic mushrooms, arsenic, and cyanide, and even tried to get his friends to join him so they could all be immortal. Despite this, he became a successful university student until the day he pushed it a little too far. After ingesting cyanide, he felt sick and asked for water. When a classmate brought it, he poured more cyanide powder into it and drank the whole thing. He boasted that nothing could kill him, but he soon went into convulsions, then a coma, and then death. Was he a gifted chemist who gave his all for science, or just a nutcase, or both? Heroes don't always get rewarded, sometimes they just dig a bigger hole. The small town of Karczówka, Poland only had 160 residents, and a big old school septic tank to handle the waste of a local hog farm. This was a dangerous, smelly job, and one day the driver who had to empty it was overcome by the intense hydrogen sulfide fumes and passed out, right into the tank. Another person jumped in to help him, and they quickly passed out and drowned as well. This would seem to be an indication to wait for help, but the people of Karczówka weren't built that way. One after another, people jumped in to search, and no one came out, except the 8th person who was eventually rescued by emergency workers. In all, the great septic tank disaster of Karczówka claimed a whopping 5% of the town's population. This next pool disaster was one of a very different sort. In Moscow, Yekaterina Didenko was a fast-rising influencer. She was celebrating her 29th birthday in style in 2020. One of the star attractions for her guests was a sprawling pool, but her guests were starting to complain that it was getting too warm, so she decided to cool it off with a flash by dropping dry ice into the pool, making it colder and adding an impressive blast of smoke. But dry ice is a form of carbon dioxide, and the area wasn't properly ventilated. The people in the area soon started choking and passing out, but by the time emergency workers got there, 3 of the influencer's guests were dead, including the husband of the host. But it's not the only death caused by social media in Russia. To build your brand as an influencer, you need exciting content, and few things are more exciting than death-defying stunts. For teenage Russian influencer Andrei Retrovsky, he had become known for taking photos in dangerous situations, like hanging from ledges high above the street. For his latest stunt, Retrovsky climbed to the top of a 9-floor building attached to a rope. He then planned to take a photo as if he were free-falling from the building. But ropes aren't foolproof, and as the young influencer threw himself off, the tether snapped and he plunged to the ground below, going viral worldwide for a very different reason than he had hoped. Selfies can be a dangerous game, even if they're supposed to be cute and furry. A fisherman in Belarus was busy at his trade when he and his friends got an unexpected visitor, a beaver. The fuzzy rodent was no doubt busy with his hard work building dams, but the fisherman decided he'd like to get a picture with it. As he approached the beaver to snap a photo, the angry critter lunged forward and bit him on the thigh. This was unlucky enough to sever an artery, and his friends tried to stem the blood flow, but the man died before help could arrive. While beavers aren't usually aggressive, authorities did warn people not to disturb the creatures. After all, they regularly bite through trees. Don't make them angry. You wouldn't like them when they're angry. Having a good time is all well and good. Just don't get carried away like this next couple did. A young couple was driving their off-road vehicle when they stopped by a lake, and their passion overcame them. They started having vigorous sex, vigorous enough that it started the vehicle moving while they were in the back seat. It started rolling into the lake, and by the time the couple realized what had happened, the water had jammed the locks, and they were unable to escape. The vehicle was eventually fished out of the water with their bodies inside, and many blamed the vehicle's design for trapping them. But authorities suggested future tragedies could be avoided by having sex in slightly safer locations. How big a disaster could some reckless soldiers cause? A town in Ukraine found out. Working at a military base is hard work, especially when you're working with heavy boxes of ammunition. So it's not a surprise a group of soldiers in 2004 needed a smoke break. They just made one fatal mistake, flicking their cigarette butts away. They didn't notice the butts started a small fire, which grew until it kicked off a chain reaction of explosions that not just engulfed the base, but the nearby town as well. Debris was tossed as much as 25 miles away, buildings within a 2-mile radius were destroyed, and thousands of people had to be evacuated. Only one of the soldiers at the base died from explosions, but the others faced serious criminal charges. That was a very costly smoke break. Snack breaks are usually safer, but not always. The Kiev Polytechnic Institute in Ukraine is usually a place of safe experiments, but one student had an unusual habit. He chewed gum while working, but he liked to dip it in citric acid crystals to give it a sour kick. He was working on a chemical experiment one night when he apparently got distracted, gave his gum the usual dip and put it in his mouth, and proceeded to blow his head off. It took a while for emergency workers to figure out what had happened, until they found another dish of powder. Apparently, he had gotten his citric acid dip confused with the chemicals he was experimenting with, and this created a much more explosive taste sensation. But no one tempted fate more than this soldier. Alexander Chichek's friends were surprised to receive a message from him on the Russian social media service VK. It looked like him holding a grenade. But there was one disturbing thing about it: the pin appeared to be pulled out. His friends panicked, warning him, but it was too late, as the grenade exploded and killed the Russian man instantly. What possessed him to try to take a live grenade selfie? Authorities believe he may have thought the grenade would only explode when someone actually threw it, because that's how it's always shown in the movies. Switzerland prides itself on being neutral, but how neutral is it really? During World War II, Switzerland didn't outwardly pick a side. This allowed both Jewish and Nazi money to be kept in their vaults. Switzerland has refused to join the European Union since its conception in 1993, but 10 years later it joined the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member. So what is actually going on with Switzerland? Why is the country willing to join some organizations and not others? How far is Bern willing to go to remain neutral, and what would it take for the nation to pick a side? Before we dive deeper into the key reasons why Switzerland has refused time and time again to join the European Union, let's first take a quick look at what neutrality means to the country and why it might not be as clear-cut as you might believe. When you think of Switzerland, you probably think of Swiss banks with loose regulations where money and riches can be safe from the authorities and foreign governments. You also probably picture the Swiss Alps and a beautiful landscape that's been spared from conflict for over a century due to its neutral stance. Oh, and cheese with holes in it. For these reasons, it might appear that Switzerland has remained neutral for so long to spare its lands and people from the ravages of war. However, looks can be deceiving, and the real reason why Switzerland has repeatedly turned down offers to join the EU and certain other international organizations is a little more complicated than what we see on the surface. Let's go back in time and examine one of the most tumultuous periods in European history. This will provide us a foundation for understanding how Swiss neutrality works and the way that the Swiss government makes decisions today. On September 1, 1939, Adolf Hitler ordered his Nazi army to invade Poland. World War II had begun, and many countries on the continent were forced to choose a side. But not everyone became a part of the Axis or the Allied powers. Switzerland decided it would remain neutral and informed both sides that it was staying out of the conflict. Switzerland and its Red Cross were given permission to repatriate captives, transfer grants in aid, and visit prisoner camps. The city of Geneva also held protective representation for leaders of 35 nations before the war broke out to broker some sort of resolution to the growing tensions. Throughout the war, Switzerland was left largely untouched. However, the fact that they were aiding both sides helped its cause. There's much controversy surrounding Switzerland's neutrality and the dealings it did during World War II, but this is a perfect example of why Switzerland won't join specific organizations like the European Union. What it comes down to is that, like with any nation, Switzerland is going to do what is best for Switzerland. And who can blame them? Switzerland provided assistance to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis. Some of its banks held Jewish money even after the war, until they were forced to pay reparations to Jewish families in 2018. To be fair, in World War II, the vast majority of Swiss citizens sympathized with the Allies and their cause, as they shared a democratic form of government. Watching Adolf Hitler's dictatorship and the Third Reich spread across Europe was likely terrifying for many Swiss people, but the fact that the country remained neutral provided some comfort. The Nazi regime promised not to invade Switzerland's borders as long as its neutral stance was maintained. That was unless Hitler conquered the Allies, then all bets were off, and there would have been little chance that Switzerland would have been spared from Nazi dominance. By remaining neutral, the Red Cross was allowed into territory controlled by both sides of the conflict to help those in need. Swiss neutrality also enabled Max Weibel, a Swiss intelligence official, to mediate a sit-down between an American official named Alan Dulles and German commanders in Italy to negotiate an early surrender that would save thousands of lives. There were pros and cons to remaining neutral in a global conflict. Now the world's more connected while simultaneously being more divided than ever. Swiss neutrality is being pushed to its limits while many countries and Europe are condemning the actions of Bern. Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine has the European Union concerned, as this is the first major conflict on the continent in decades. And although most countries in Europe are a part of NATO, meaning they receive support from the world's largest and most powerful military, the United States, Switzerland's continuous refusal to join the EU has baffled many. We'll dive deeper into the history of Swiss neutrality a bit later on, but let's discuss why Switzerland has yet to join the European Union. As you'll find out, it has less to do with remaining neutral than you might think. Number 1. Economics. One of the main reasons that Switzerland has consistently refused to join the EU is that it doesn't make a whole lot of economic sense. The Swiss economy is strong and stable. The country's GDP is around 740 billion euros a year, making it the 6th largest economy in Europe. Therefore, there's no real economic benefit to joining the EU. Switzerland already has free trade deals with most of the continent, and if it were to join the alliance, it would become one of the net contributors to the European Union. This means they would support countries with weaker economies and would not benefit much from doing so. In an ideal world, nations would help one another whenever they needed it, but that's not the world we live in. People working in Switzerland also earn much higher wages than most parts of Europe. The average Swiss salary is around 6,665 Swiss francs, or 6,971 euros a month. To put this into perspective, Switzerland's neighbor Italy has an average monthly salary of approximately 2,479 euros, meaning that the average wage is almost 3 times more in Switzerland than Italy. The concern with joining the EU is that it'll open Switzerland's borders and economy to wage dumping, where employers begin lowering salaries and undercutting one another because there's an influx of workers looking for jobs who are willing to do the same work for less. The Swiss are also concerned that there would be an influx of immigration into its welfare system as well. The free movement of people and workers throughout the European Union is one of the reasons why many supported Brexit in the UK. It's also why many Swiss citizens don't want their country to join the EU. The influx of new laborers could be detrimental to the Swiss workers. Joining the European Union likely wouldn't cause the Swiss economy to collapse, and an influx of workers could even boost the economy. Still, the fear of outsiders and what it'll do to wages and jobs has led to the majority of Swiss people voting against joining the EU. Then there are the regulations that come with joining the European Union. The anonymity and loose regulatory framework that many Swiss banks and financial institutions enjoy would be gone. Countries, businesses, and individuals that keep vast sums of money in Swiss banks would likely no longer feel comfortable doing so and pull their funds to put in financial institutions that operate in countries not associated with strict organizations such as the EU. This obviously would be bad for business and the Swiss economy. Interestingly, the neutrality that Switzerland has maintained by not joining the EU or other alliances has increased its arms sales industry. Some governments do not like buying weapons from countries that are tied to strict alliances. If Switzerland became a part of the EU, its neutrality would be brought into question. When a government purchases arms from a large military power such as the United States, Russia, or China, the weapons often come with strings attached. On the other hand, Switzerland's neutrality allows foreign governments to procure arms without having to worry about taking a side in future conflicts. This is very attractive to some nations and allows Switzerland to sell around 1 billion euros worth of weapons each year. Between 2021 and 2022, Swiss arms deals increased by 29%, showing that demand for their weapons is high. However, joining the European Union could hurt these sales rather than improve them. Number 2. Russia. It may seem counterintuitive, but Russia and the continued aggression against Ukraine is actually driving Switzerland away from forming alliances and joining the EU, rather than toward it. Many nations have sought to strengthen their alliances in the wake of Russia's aggression. For example, both Finland and Sweden, two countries that remained neutral for decades, applied to join NATO. Finland has become a full member, and Sweden is waiting for one holdout, Turkey, to agree to its admittance into the organization. However, while some countries look to join alliances, Switzerland is heading the other direction. The difference between Switzerland and other neutral countries that are starting to join alliances is its location. Switzerland sits in the middle of the European continent, surrounded by Germany, France, Italy, Austria, and Liechtenstein. Germany and France are two of the strongest militaries in the world. Therefore, if Russia or another foreign threat ever decides to invade Europe or a member of the European Union, Switzerland would be surrounded by some heavy hitters who would serve as a barrier in a potential future conflict. Their landlocked location and neighbors protect the country even as it remains neutral. Sweden and Finland, on the other hand, don't have that same luxury. Finland shares a border of around 1,340 kilometers with Russia, and Sweden's massive coastline, which runs along the Baltic Sea, makes it susceptible to Russian naval vessels. There's no overwhelming security benefit for Switzerland if they were to join the European Union. Article 42.7 of the Treaty of Lisbon set up the Mutual Defense Clause, where if one member of the EU is attacked by an aggressor, the rest of the members will come to their aid. This basically negates any form of neutrality of countries that are part of the European Union. This is a massive turnoff for many Swiss policymakers and citizens. We'll discuss why neutrality is so important to Switzerland and the history it's ingrained into the Swiss culture. But for right now, it's important to know that many Swiss policy decisions consider the country's neutral stance ahead of all else. It's interesting to note that Switzerland does have a military and purchases weapons and vehicles from other nations. The Swiss armed forces have just over 100,000 active personnel, around 280 tanks, approximately 134 of which are Leopard 2s, and about 40 fighter aircraft, most being Lockheed Martin F-35s. The Swiss government recently passed a bill to increase military spending from 5.6 billion Swiss francs to 7 billion, or 5.86 billion euros to 7.33 billion euros by 2030. This would bring the total military budget above 1% of the country's total GDP. Between 1990 and 2019, Swiss military spending dropped from 1.34% to 0.67% of its GDP. Number 3. Politics. Joining the European Union is inviting to countries that have struggled through tumultuous governments in the past. The EU provides a form of stability in that all nations that are part of the organization must maintain a form of democratic government. This allows populations in the EU countries peace of mind. This is incredibly important for nations that were formerly part of the Soviet bloc or experienced some form of fascism in the past. Switzerland has maintained a stable democratic government for over a century. The trauma that's associated with living under an oppressive regime is long-lasting in a population, but this is not something Switzerland has had to contend with. The Swiss government has stood staunchly neutral in foreign affairs ever since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when it regained its independence. It's worked so well for so long that the government and Swiss citizens are hesitant to change the diplomatic view of the nation. Staying out of the European Union has given the Swiss government the autonomy to continue doing business as usual, allowing it to do what's best for Switzerland itself. This means the nation can continue to be a neutral ground where countries broker peace deals or conflicts can be discussed. If Switzerland became part of the EU, the autonomy to carry out impartial negotiations would be lost. And since Switzerland prides itself on being a safe space for discussions to occur, the policies of the government must reflect that stance. Switzerland is content with looking inward and bringing its citizens prosperity. The European Union allowed countries like France and Germany to extend their power and influence on a global scale. Bern has little interest in influencing global matters or expanding its control beyond its borders. Instead, by staying out of the European Union, Switzerland has remained autonomous, and it isn't forced to support other nations in the alliance to further foreign interests. At the individual level, the Swiss people hold tightly to their direct democracy. Many fear that joining the European Union would take away some of their political power that they hold today. For example, joining the alliance would restrict particular referendums that would not conform to EU ideals. For the most part, the Swiss do not want to see changes made to their own government, especially when they're dictated by outside forces, such as the European Commission. Therefore, joining the EU is not just unpopular at the government level, but at the individual level in Switzerland as well. When polled on why they don't want to join the EU, the #1 concern for most Swiss citizens is that it would jeopardize their nation's sovereignty. This has led to slogans being created against Switzerland joining the EU, such as "foreign judges." The people of Switzerland embrace their independence and do not want outside forces interfering with how their country is run and how their lives are lived. The Swiss government has bilateral agreements with almost every nation in the European Union, and these agreements often benefit Switzerland more than the other country. It would make no sense for the government to give up these beneficial deals to join the EU when it's already getting everything it wants while remaining neutral. The status quo favors Switzerland right now, which is why the government, businesses, and people do not want to join the EU. But how did Switzerland get into such a strong position while remaining neutral for so long? And how has the past influenced the decisions being made in the present and the future? For the answers to these questions, we'll need to go back in time and examine how Switzerland got to where it is today. Swiss neutrality and the foundation of many of the diplomatic decisions the country currently makes began in 1648. Like all nations, the borders of Switzerland have changed over time as conflicts arose and ended on the European continent. However, the Peace of Westphalia, which brought an end to the 30 Years' War and was agreed upon in 1648, was the first formal declaration of neutrality for Switzerland. Unfortunately, in 1803 the Napoleonic Wars began and regions of Switzerland were once again invaded and held by a foreign ruler until 1815, when the Congress of Vienna re-established the borders of the nation. Ever since then, Switzerland has remained neutral, at least to a certain extent. When Switzerland declared it would be a country of perpetual neutrality going forward at the Congress of Vienna, an agreement was made that the nation would not take part in future conflicts or provide mercenaries to any other country. In return, the nations of Europe promised not to fight any more wars on Swiss land. In 1874, the Swiss constitution was revised to function as a direct democracy by referendum. This meant that the people of Switzerland now had the right to vote on major decisions made in the country instead of having representatives be a proxy for what they wanted. When World War I broke out in 1914, Switzerland vowed to remain neutral. During this time, the Red Cross formed its own units that would aid the wounded throughout the conflict. After the conclusion of the Great War, the Treaty of Versailles once again reaffirmed Switzerland's neutrality. In 1920, Switzerland joined the League of Nations, which meant the government would work closely with other nations in Europe to maintain peace. The headquarters of the League was established in Geneva. However, over the next 2 decades, peace would fall apart, and Europe would be plunged into a second world war. When the Nazis invaded Poland in 1939, Switzerland's Federal Council declared the nation would once again remain neutral. This was somewhat true, as Switzerland and its institutions would aid both sides, but would engage in some questionable practices when it came to collecting and storing both Nazi and Jewish money. It has been argued that Switzerland's neutrality during World War II was an act of cowardice that allowed the Swiss government to distance itself from the Nazi atrocities while simultaneously benefiting from laundered German money. Others state that since Switzerland remained neutral, it allowed them to act as a mediator and bring the war to a close. The neutral nature of Switzerland and the ethics of its stance during World War II are still debated by historians. In 1959, Switzerland became one of the founding members of the European Free Trade Association. During this time, its 4-party government system was developed, which became known as the Magic Formula. Having 4 parties allowed for political stability and the balancing of ideas and ideologies in the government itself. However, there were still some difficulties and nationalist views that would arise. Right-wing groups campaigned to restrict the entry of foreign workers, and it wasn't until 1971 that women were given the right to vote in federal elections in Switzerland. It would take another 14 years after that for a referendum to finally pass that guaranteed women legal equality with men within their marriages. The Swiss people were still staunchly neutral during this time, and a referendum in 1986 for Switzerland to join the United Nations was shot down by a margin of 3-1. Conservative views around immigration and maintaining the status quo in Switzerland were largely popular at the time. In 1992, Switzerland joined the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, but rejected a proposal to join the European Economic Area. This was because joining the EEA would have resulted in more restrictions for Swiss businesses and served no real benefit to the country itself. For many nations, it became clear Switzerland was cherry-picking which organizations to join and deals to make in order to further its economic aspirations. The Swiss government had no intentions of becoming closer to the rest of Europe to create a more unified political, economic, and military organization. During the 1990s, there was a shift in the country to hold the Swiss government accountable and make reparations for past actions. In 1994, a referendum passed that made racial discrimination and the denial of the Holocaust illegal. The Swiss Banking Association was later pressured by activist and Jewish groups in 1998 to give back around 1.25 billion euros to Holocaust survivors and their families. This led to a settlement being paid out to those people for cash that had been continuously held in Swiss banks since World War II, instead of being returned to Jewish families. By the turn of the century, things began to change in Switzerland. A 1999 election saw more right-wing votes for the Swiss People's Party. This conservative group became Switzerland's second strongest political party by securing around a quarter of the populace's votes. And even though the Swiss people rejected a proposal to open talks about joining the European Union in 2001, the Swiss parliament overwhelmingly voted to join the United Nations, as the UN was a peacekeeping organization. When the vote to join the UN was put to referendum, it passed with only a slight majority, as many Swiss citizens believed that it would entangle their country in foreign affairs and jeopardize the nation's long-standing neutrality. Even still, Switzerland ended up joining the United Nations the following year. In 2003, the right-wing Swiss People's Party became the most represented political party in parliament. It won close to 28% of the votes in the general election. That December, the Swiss People's Party gained a second post in the 7-seat government, while the Christian Democrats lost one, altering the magic formula that's kept Swiss politics stable since 1959. With the right-wing political group now more prominent in the government, naturalization laws became more strict. By 2006, voters in a national referendum supported plans to make Switzerland's asylum laws some of the toughest in the Western world. In the 2007 elections, the Swiss People's Party increased its standing when it received nearly 29% of the vote. Up until this point, the Swiss government, which increased support for the right-wing Swiss People's Party, had made decisions that kept Switzerland away from policies that could bring the nation's neutrality into question. However, in January 2009, the Swiss economy went into recession. The government announced it would relax some of its banking secrecy laws and cooperate with international investigations concerning tax evasion. By the following year, the Swiss economy was growing again. In 2011, it was decided by the government that the Swiss franc would be pegged to the euro. This was in response to businesses and manufacturers warning that the strength of the franc was making Swiss exports uncompetitive in the European market. Pegging the Swiss franc to the euro would keep the country from falling into a second recession in only a few years. In October 2011, the Swiss People's Party started losing support and seats in the parliamentary elections. It still remained the largest party, but its numbers were dwindling. Switzerland reimposed strict immigration quotas on workers from Central and Eastern Europe. The EU criticized this move, but Switzerland carried on anyway. It became more and more clear that even though some hoped the Swiss would join the EU around this time, that dream was far from becoming a reality. When the euro began to depreciate in 2014, the Swiss National Bank unpegged the franc, causing its currency to rise drastically. Then came the pandemic and the war in Ukraine. During COVID, the world remained isolated. Being neutral was easy. However, as Sweden and Finland found out, neutrality was much harder to maintain when Russia invaded Ukraine. There are two views on Swiss neutrality by its citizens in the current climate. The first is more conservative and supported by the Swiss People's Party. This side wants to maintain a strict interpretation of neutrality by not sending aid to Ukraine or engaging with Russia. The idea is Switzerland will remain neutral no matter what happens in the rest of Europe to keep the country out of any conflicts. The Swiss People's Party is even trying to launch an initiative to embed a comprehensive neutrality clause within the Swiss constitution. The more liberal side of the neutrality argument, which is supported by the majority of the government, is considered active neutrality. This would allow Switzerland to work with other organizations and nations such as the UN to play an active role in maintaining peace and aiding in humanitarian efforts. Switzerland already abides by UN sanctions, which shows that it has taken a more actively neutral stance than a conservative one. However, even many liberal Swiss are still not willing to join the European Union, as it would cause Switzerland to definitely give up its neutrality while simultaneously bringing Swiss sovereignty into question. To ensure that active neutrality is not confused with Switzerland taking a strong stance against Russia, it's banned NATO members from flying over its airspace while bringing supplies and weapons to Ukraine. Bern has also refused to grant Germany and Denmark permission to give Ukraine any tanks, ammunition, or weapons bought from Switzerland. This has caused much of Europe and NATO to condemn Switzerland's neutral stance as Russia continues to wage a war against Ukraine and its people. Bern can remain neutral since Switzerland is protected by its geographic location and the nations surrounding it. Even as other countries scramble to join organizations like NATO, Switzerland has the luxury of holding on to its neutrality. The concept is deeply ingrained in Switzerland's culture and will not be given up easily, which is why the Swiss have continually refused to join the European Union. Until there's a clear economic or political incentive for Switzerland to give up its neutrality and form closer ties with other European nations, it's very unlikely the government or the Swiss people will vote to become a part of the EU anytime soon. After the devastation it suffered in World War II, Poland was a struggling nation, and life didn't get any easier when it became a satellite state of the Soviet Union. But Poland has been clawing back its status as a major player in Europe, and some are saying it might even soon surpass the once mighty Great Britain as a major world power, both economically and militarily. That is a big claim. So let's examine Poland's rise to power and how it might just be turning into Europe's next superpower. If you went to Poland a few decades ago, around the time Coca-Cola was still regarded as something of a luxury item and a symbol of American capitalist imperialism, life might have looked a little grim. This was a country that had been torn apart in the war, hit from two sides by the Germans and the Soviets, and then faced decades of hardship under communist rule. In historical terms, Poland has certainly experienced some extreme ups and downs. As the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the early 17th century, Poland was a force to be reckoned with, able to defend itself against other powers and more than capable of its own aggressive actions against its neighbors. At its peak, the Commonwealth was home to 11 million people and had spread itself over 1 million square kilometers, compared to Poland today, which is 313,930 square kilometers. Much of Ukraine was under Polish rule for much of this period, which Russia fought it for. But the Commonwealth was easily a match for Russia. In fact, in the Polish-Muscovite War of 1605 to 1618, the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth made substantial territorial gains in the region on the European front, something Russia would never forget. This was the Polish Golden Age, though, a renaissance period for Poland. The country was a major political, military, and economic power, and while it never quite reached the heights of other great European powers or colonized other nations, its prowess allowed its culture and language to spread far and wide, a process known as Polonization. But then came the downfall, where Poland was in effect erased as a nation. Bit by bit, the country was taken apart in what we now call the Partitions of Poland. These occurred piecemeal in 1772, 1793, and 1795. Russia, Prussia, and Austria together picked Poland apart, and Poland wasn't militarily strong enough to stop those huge territorial seizures from happening, which had been weakened from its oligarchical rule. In just the first partition, Poland lost around half of its population, or around 1/3 or 81,500 square miles of its land. In the second, Russia and Prussia took another 115,000 square miles, and after those two countries quelled a Polish uprising in 1794, Poland lost another 83,000 square miles. Austria grabbed what was then known as Little Poland, an area southeast of the country that contained the city of Krakow. This was not a great time in Polish history. For 123 years, there was no autonomous state known as Poland. But then, under Napoleon Bonaparte, the Duchy of Warsaw was created in 1807 after Poles fought alongside him. This was a client state of France, but something close to Polish sovereignty. Then Napoleon later failed miserably in his invasion of Russia, after which European powers decided what to do with the borders and territories in the meetings known as the Congress of Vienna from 1814 to 1815. That saw the end of the Duchy of Warsaw, making it so Poland was once again firmly divided into parcels owned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. The Congress Kingdom of Poland was created, but it was under Russian rule. Then in 1830, there was the November Uprising, in which the Russians eventually quelled a Polish rebellion, after which in 1832, the Russian Emperor Nicholas I issued the Organic Statute of the Kingdom of Poland. This was an attempt to erase any autonomy the Polish had in Russian-occupied Poland. Meanwhile, there was widespread persecution of Poles, sometimes referred to as anti-Polonism, which would last for centuries not only amongst the three partition countries, later from the Germans and the Ukrainian nationalists. All this hardship shaped how many Poles feel today about their nation, especially the more recent tough times Poland has faced. The country only regained its independence in 1918, but then just 2 decades later it was invaded from two sides at the beginning of the World War. After almost 6 million Poles died in the war, and then it became a client state of the Soviet Union. It's thought Poland lost around 38% of its national resources and infrastructure in the war, and while the Germans were supposed to pay back Poland in reparations, that did not happen, or at least not as it should have. The Soviets ensured reparations came from Soviet-controlled East Germany, so those reparations didn't exactly look like a windfall. Poland not only went without these large reparations from Germany, but it was also not part of the Marshall Plan, which was the US initiative to help war-torn Western Europe. The communist years were marked by almost constant crises, often resulting in protests when the low standard of living was too much for many Poles to take. There were numerous reforms and there was constant repression, although many Poles saw the light at the end of the tunnel when in 1970 Edward Gierek became the first secretary of the Polish United Workers' Party. He promised to improve people's lives and partly opened Poland up to the West while allowing much more freedom of speech and expression than those that had come before him. For many, Gierek's era was the first time they owned luxury goods such as a car or a TV. He oversaw the construction of the now famous Polish town blocks. He built the first highway in the country while creating and strengthening other industries. He built steel works and glass works, and under him the automobile factory that produced the famous Polski Fiat 126P was constructed. Poland was still poor, but life did improve for many, and Gierek's relatively liberal attitude compared to the leaders that had preceded him was like breathing fresh air after living in a stuffy smokehouse for 2 decades. Alas, Gierek borrowed a lot of money from the West to fuel his plans, around $40 billion, which eventually brought an economic crisis to Poland. And by the end of his tenure in 1981, sights such as people queuing around the block for many hours just to buy a roll of toilet paper were a regular occurrence. People weren't just broke, many didn't even have food, and there was talks of uprisings. Poland's GDP per capita in 1979 had been $2,167, and in 1980, it was down to $1,595. Compare that to Britain, where the GDP capita was around $10,000. In the US, it was $12,000. France had similar numbers, while Spain was around $6,000. Portugal was $3,300 and Italy $8,000. Poland was poor, and it seemed like the country could never catch a break, something that might partly be driving Poland's rise to power now. Economic experts talk about how GDP doesn't always tell the full story of how well people live. And that's correct, but in 1981, Poland was indeed an economic tragedy. People struggled to buy the most basic necessities. The police were highly corrupt, as were most other officials, and the regular working person didn't have much hope. The Rzeczpospolita daily newspaper wrote that in the summer of 1981, Poland was at the bottom of the crisis, stating that Warsaw was so poor that the buses couldn't run because there wasn't enough money to replace tires. As food was rationed and people could buy just a few pounds of meat per month, citizens took to the streets flying banners that showed a black skull with a knife and fork crossed below. People shouted in unison, "We are tired of being hungry. We are tired of queuing. We demand life on the level of a civilized country." The New York Times wrote on July 30, 1981, that anger over food spreads in Poland, and that there was a new wave of unrest as people called out that they were hungry, they wanted bread, they wanted meat. They said they had enough of lies and threatened that the hungry will eat the authorities. The government responded by implementing martial law, blaming the food shortages on strikes. While not the response the protesters were looking for in some ways, it was a slight improvement, since in the decades earlier being part of a protest might have meant torture and a bullet in the back. So, this was Poland in 1981, a year before much of the world watched E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and saw how young American kids living among pretty tree-lined streets didn't seem to have much to worry about other than their next bicycle adventure through their beautiful suburbs. And in those kinds of films, when someone opened the refrigerator door, inside was more food than you could dream of. Poland was another world completely. Polish people wanted that reality, and now many of them have it. If you visit Poland today, while there is still poverty of course, the days of food shortages seem to Poles like another world. There's a collective breath of fresh air being breathed in, and this one is no flash in the pan like the late 70s when the government got so reckless with borrowing. The present seems like a new golden age to those that suffered through wars and communism. Meanwhile, news media in the UK is saying Poland will soon overtake the UK as a major European power. This is huge if it's true. We're talking about a country that had the biggest empire the world has ever seen being overtaken by a country that couldn't even feed its citizens just a few decades ago. And the UK's decline and Poland's rise serve as a comparison for each other, so we'll show you just how far Poland has come. As many Poles are now enjoying this relatively good patch in their history, Meanwhile, in the UK, between the 1st of April 2022 and the 31st of March 23, a leading UK charity said it distributed 3 million emergency food parcels, an increase of 37% from the same period the year before. In what's called the cost of living crisis, demand for food banks hit an all-time high in the UK. Sure, Poland has food banks too, but the difference is that most people that use them, according to the European Food Banks Association, are refugees. In the UK, it's the general populace that's now unable to feed themselves, sometimes even with a full-time job. Hundreds of thousands of Poles emigrated to the UK over the last 20 years, but now the British media is saying they're returning to their homeland in droves, a homeland now being called the Land of Opportunity. The Sunday Times said the standard of living in Poland is improving, while British standards are declining. The cost of living in the UK is increasing, as is the crime rate, and as are waiting lines at hospitals. Is this an exaggeration? A recent article we found titled "Traveling Across Poland Showed Me That Britain's Economy is Broken" described ugly and forlorn-looking former industrial towns in Britain full of betting shops, pawn shops, and discount supermarkets. In larger cities, he found people sleeping in doorways everywhere. He wrote, OECD using GDP per capita at purchasing power parity. Cities like Warsaw, Poznan, Krakow, and Wrocław are all wealthier than Liverpool, Birmingham, and Manchester. He said he found the differences in how much better life was in Polish cities immediately obvious. What happened to the seemingly unsinkable ship of Great Britain, and how did Poland manage to become so much stronger than it had been in the past? Poland initiated major economic reform in 1989 when it transitioned to a capitalist market economy. Small and medium state-owned companies were privatized, and the private business sector flourished as Poland was viewed by its neighbors as business-friendly. It began to receive a lot of foreign direct investment, or FDI, since it soon had a highly skilled workforce and was cheaper than much of Western Europe as a place to do business. The country soon became one of the world's so-called economic miracles. It was the growth champion of Europe, experiencing better growth than even those Asian tiger economies such as Taiwan, Singapore, and South Korea. Also, Poland managed to largely avoid recession in the global economic crisis of 2008 and 2009. As the GDP for the European Union as a whole decreased by 4.5%, the Polish GDP actually increased by 1.6% when the crisis was at its worst. One of the worst countries hit was Great Britain, which had for years banked on its, banking industry. It eventually became the G7's worst-ranked nation for business investment, quite the opposite of Poland, which focused on building brainpower and business development. This was a country that in 1990 had a GDP per capita of a paltry $1,731, which was minuscule when you consider Britain's was about $19,000. France at the time was about $21,000, and the US about $23,000. Spain was around $13,000 and Portugal was $7,000. Poland was still poor, but it was about to change those glaring GDP shortfalls. When Poland joined the European Union in May of 2004, its economy was subsequently turbocharged. And this wasn't the result of flogging all its natural resources or some kind of banking magic. The reason, as many economists have pointed out, is Poland's diversified economy, and more importantly, the brainpower of the public, which has embraced entrepreneurship. The government promoted competition while putting much emphasis on higher education. In 1989, only about 1 in 10 young Poles studied at the university level. Now it's 1 in 2, higher than the EU average. In a study published by the Program for International Student Assessment, or PISA, it revealed that Poland was one of the leading countries in the world regarding educational standard improvements. Poland's PISA score for reading, math, and science was one of the highest in the world at 12th place, behind countries such as China, Singapore, Korea, Japan, Switzerland, and the Netherlands. The UK was down to 26th place, but it was at least above Italy, Spain, and the US. PISA said Polish 15-year-olds are more functionally literate than most kids in the EU and North America. The country's also become an IT hub. The European Commission recently made a list of the strongest tech innovators in Europe, and Poland was placed in the emerging innovator bracket. The UK didn't even make the list. We're not trying to pick on the UK here, it's just the press has been talking a lot about how Poland will overtake the UK as a power, so we've chosen the UK as a comparison in which to judge Poland's ascension as a power. Poland is now said to be a leader in the Central and Eastern European region for greenfield investments, which are investments where a company starts a new venture by constructing new facilities from the ground up, rather than purchasing or leasing existing ones. Ranking as third best in Europe, Its location between East and West Europe hasn't always worked out well for Poland, but now with its much improved transportation infrastructure, it's in the perfect place to bridge developed economies in Central and Eastern Europe. 94% of investors are reported to be willing to reinvest in Poland, in part because it offers smart investment incentives, and according to Statistica, it's the most attractive country in the region in which to invest. It's always a good sign for an economy when foreign countries want to invest there. The Swedish battery manufacturer Northvolt just opened Europe's largest factory for energy storage systems in Poland. In 2023, Microsoft said it was impressed with Poland's IT scene and opened its first data center there, calling Poland the newest trusted cloud region, and the data center the first in Central and Eastern Europe for Microsoft. Google has also opened a data hub in what it says is Poland's thriving IT industry. Poland is excelling in the area of aerospace, which is evident when you look at its so-called Aviation Valley in the southeast of the country. 115 companies are working there, which employ 23,000 technicians, engineers, and designers. Other large industries in Poland are agriculture, automotive, energy, defense, manufacturing, and tourism. Speaking of the latter, besides many cities with outstanding architecture, Poland also has vast wilderness to be explored. It's home to the Central Eastern Europe's largest number of areas on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Poland has been one of the best performers in terms of European tourism booms over the last decade. Poland's also described as a good place to live in general, and now often makes it onto lists of the best places to live in Europe, with people saying you get good bang for your buck in Poland. If you look at various lists of countries in Europe where expats and digital nomads are drawn to for low prices but high standards, Poland generally is featured on those lists, which means drawing talent from the global talent pool. Still, Poles earn less than Brits on average. The UK in 2023 had a per capita GDP of about $46,000, and Poland wasn't even half of that, at around $19,000. France's was $44,000, Italy $36,000, and Portugal at $26,000. Poland is still a bit behind, but nothing like it was in recent past when its GDP wasn't even a tenth of the UK's, and if trends are anything to go by, it'll overtake the UK's soon enough. We should add again, though, that you can't look solely at GDP and know what life is like for people in a nation. Ireland has a massive per capita GDP, double that of the UK, but only because huge multinational companies have operations there. A recent survey showed 7 out of 10 young Irish people wanted to move out of Ireland because they believed they'd find a better standard of living elsewhere. Wealth isn't spread out equally, which is why you have much of the UK currently relying on food banks, and millions of homeowners are finding themselves priced out of life after what AP in 2023 said were skyrocketing energy and food costs stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. GDP per capita doesn't always mean a lot. People are saying life in Poland right now is better for your average Joe, or shall we say Joseph, than it is in Britain, despite the GDP difference. This is a country on the rise. To understand the standard of living, it's better to look at what you get for your money, what safety nets are provided for you, how well educated you are, and what chance you have of flourishing in the workplace. You can also look at forums to get perspectives from average citizens, and we did just that. One man said, "I'm 31, born and bred in the UK, and I've recently moved to Poland. The first thing you notice is that you get a lot more for your money in Poland." He talked about how safe he felt, how inspiring it was to see how proud people are to be Polish. He added, "Poland will afford you a much better quality of life with plenty of surplus to spare." Another poster said when comparing the two nations that in Poland you had safety, better food, better quality and better educated people, intelligent and beautiful women, great, amazing and rich culture, better social and interhuman styles, more polite and educated society on the main. One person wrote in Poland he found low cost of living versus a fantastically high standard of living. Great education, okay to decent food, great travel locations, friendly people, and lovely weather. We don't want to idealize Poland, and of course these forums are to some extent self-selecting, but we found literally 0 people who lived in both countries that didn't prefer Poland. This hope and pride the first person talked about, which is partly related to the tough time we explained that Poles have had, account for a lot when we're considering Poland's present and future development. The British are suffering a confidence crisis, a national disillusionment, and many people have lost hope in their governance. A recent survey revealed 73% of those living in the UK said they didn't trust the government to help improve their lives, whether on the right side or the left side. 56% of Poles said they distrusted their own government, but 55% said they trusted the EU. The economic analyst Matt Klein recently explained that things in the UK are worse than GDP per capita makes it seem. He said, "Take out Greater London, the prosperity of which depends to an uncomfortable degree on a willingness to provide services to oligarchs from the Middle East and the former Soviet Union, and the UK is one of the poorest countries in Western Europe." The same article explained that the UK has become a dark triad of deindustrialization, degrowth, and denigration of foreigners. Considering per capita growth and productivity growth per person, the UK is actually the worst in the G7 with its yearly decreases. But Poland's per capita growth has been increasing every year. That doesn't mean as Poland becomes a more mature economy, it'll stay that way, but right now the arrows are all facing up. The average growth in Poland is 3.6%, while in the UK it was hovering around 0.5%. If this trend continues, Poland will indeed surpass the UK, while Hungary and Romania will do the same by 2040. Unlike Poland, the 2008 financial crisis hit Britain, a finance hub, hard. The government decided to pursue a policy of austerity, fearing debt while not focusing on productivity. Foreign exports declined, as did foreign investment, while wages couldn't keep up with inflation. Productivity hasn't been this low in Britain since the 18th century, and according to most experts, there are no signs of recovery at the moment. Much of the recent concern in Britain came when Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer said, "The British people are falling behind, while our European neighbours get richer, in the East as well as in countries like France and Germany. I'm not comfortable with that. Not comfortable with a trajectory that will soon see Britain overtaken by Poland." He would say that as he wants to blame the people he wants to replace, but he has a point. With a large economy, a military usually follows, which can help seal your standing as a great power. And Poland is no exception. The Polish government said in 2023 that it would raise defense spending from 2.4% of its gross domestic product to 5%. The Polish defense minister Mariusz Błaszczak said Poland is working toward having the most powerful land forces in Europe. Poland already has more tanks and howitzers than its neighbor Germany, and the country says it'll have 300,000 troops by 2035, compared to Germany's current 184,000 and the UK's 231,000. Poland presently has about 152,000 military personnel. Meanwhile, according to the website Global Firepower, while the UK has the 5th most powerful military in the world, how long can it keep investing in its military if its poorest people can no longer afford to live in their houses and buy their groceries? These people may not take kindly to being told their military is expanding as they starve. That's no exaggeration. Reports in 2023 said nearly 1 in 5 low-income families experience food insecurity. 10 million British adults and 4 million children engage in daily intermittent fasting, not because they heard it advertised on a podcast, but because they can't afford to eat. Just recently, Poland inked a deal with South Korea to buy $13.7 billion worth of military equipment, including 82 K2 Black Panther tanks, 200 K9 Thunder howitzers, 48 Fa-50 light attack aircraft, and 218 K239 Chunmoo rocket launchers. Poland also recently bought 250 Abrams tanks from the US and 32 F-35 fighters, all costing around $10 billion. The US also sold $4.75 billion worth of Patriot missiles to Poland, adding to an approved anti-missile defense system. Poland also purchased 18 Advanced Combat High Mobility Artillery Rocket Systems, or HIMARS, for $414 million. For the future, the two nations have agreed to a $10 billion deal, which include 500 HIMARS, 468 launcher-loader module kits, 45 M57 Army Tactical Missile Systems, or ATACMS, and hundreds of guided multiple-launch rockets and warheads. The U.S. said this will improve Poland's military goals of updating capability while further enhancing interoperability with the United States and other allies. With Russia next to Poland, the U.S. is more than happy to support Poland's aspirations of becoming the next big European power. Poland's huge rearmament programs, including a $2.4 billion contract for British CAMS air defense missiles in 2023, tells us Poland means business. The country's defense budget has increased to $30 billion, which at 4.25% of Poland's GDP is the highest proportion of GDP in all NATO nations. Poland is looking to be the kind of military power it was back in its golden age. A military pundit said that no Western country wants to scale up its military so much and so fast. The former NATO spokesman, Jamie Shea, agreed with that, saying Poland will become the strongest military power on land in Central and Eastern Europe. If that's true, with a strong military and a leading GDP, Poland will indeed become a regional great power. The US will also help Poland with its new nuclear energy plan. Another pundit said Poland looks set to become Europe's industrial as well as military powerhouse. Let's face it, Poland knows it must protect itself, given what's happened in the past. As it becomes wealthier and its people become better off, they might not mind such hefty military spending. Considering Poland's recent past, this is quite an economic miracle. The question is, will it last? Even with all of Poland's successes, many Poles don't trust what is reported to be their right-wing nationalist government. Just recently, hundreds of thousands of people marched in the capital Warsaw, saying their government has violated the Constitution and is eroding people's fundamental democratic rights. These people like the EU, but they don't like the government, which they fear will turn into another autocracy. Even so, Polish people are flocking back to their homeland. A reverse brain drain is taking place, which has seen them leaving the UK and other countries and returning to Poland, where they say there's more hope for them. They've heard the news about the booming tech industry and the fact that the World Trade Organization said in 2022 that Poland beat countries such as China, India, and Brazil for growth in online services. The Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki said not long ago Polish people are starting to realize that there are exciting opportunities waiting for them back home. In January 2022, Poland's finance ministry created the Polish Deal, which lured people back by allowing them to pay zero income tax for the first 4 years after they've resettled. Poland is even attracting US software engineers. One of them said in 2023, people in Poland have more hobbies outside of work, whereas in the UK, work is your life. People like to spend time with their family more in Poland. She said salaries in Poland are now catching up to salaries in the US. Some British firms have now started setting up operations in the EU since after Brexit. They say there are higher costs and numerous new trading rules. It might seem ironic that some British companies are setting up shop in Poland. A writer for an economy-focused website wrote in 2023, Poland is actively courting British firms. But will things stay this way? Will Britain bounce back? Will the Phoenix of Poland proceed to the heights of a European superpower? In a decade or so, could Polish people be complaining about all the Brit immigrants trying to enter their country and take their jobs? We can't say for certain this will happen, but as things stand, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Many people think overpopulation is the biggest threat the human race will face in the future, but this is not true. The biggest problem of the future is actually population decline. In a world where the population in a country decreases rapidly, economies will crash, aging citizens won't be able to get the help they need, and progress will stall. You might be thinking, aren't there already too many people on the planet using too many resources? Or wouldn't a smaller population be better for everyone? The answer to this and your other burning questions are all about to be answered. First, let's be clear. Humans are not in danger of overpopulating the planet. There are vast amounts of resources, and although they're limited, we likely could never reach the carrying capacity of Earth. Instead, the real problem is that people living in wealthier nations consume much more resources than they should. It's overconsumption that's driving the current problems of climate change and resource loss. Even still, you would assume less people would equal less consumption, and therefore population decline could be a good thing. But this is not necessarily the case. To better understand the ramifications of population decline in a country, we must first examine what causes it, why it's harmful, and which countries are in the most danger because of it. There are several nations whose populations are already in decline. However, even in countries that are still currently growing, most will begin to stagnate in the near future as birth rates decrease. This is one of the key reasons why populations are starting to fall around the world. Over the last couple of decades, women have been choosing to have fewer children or to start families later in life. As birth rates and the number of children in a family decline, the population also declines as older generations pass away. However, there are other ways that a country's population can decline even if birth rates exceed death rates. For example, in countries like Venezuela, birth rates are still high, but immigration rates are causing a decline in the country's population. Due to the economic crisis and harsh living conditions, more and more Venezuelans are leaving for a better life outside their home country. This happens in many other places around the world, and it's a combination of declining birth rates and high immigration rates that can cause populations to rapidly decrease. The causes of a population decline have a large effect on a country itself. Unfortunately, even though there are several pros to a decreasing population, such as more space for native habitats to regrow and less strain on natural resources, there are many cons as well. Let's discuss the repercussions a country faces when it can find itself with a dwindling population size. The scariest part of this whole thing is that most countries in Europe, Asia, and much of the Americas are about to experience these phenomena. The main concern for many countries is that a declining population can have drastic consequences on their economy. Less young people means less workers are entering the workforce every year. This is a huge problem because as older generations retire, there are fewer and fewer people to take their place. A shrinking labor pool inevitably leads to a decrease in economic growth. If a country doesn't have enough workers for entry-level jobs, entire businesses come crumbling to the ground. A huge economic burden is placed on those who are working, as they need to pick up the slack of the increasing number of retirees. The working class is forced to put in ever-increasing amounts of money to social services to ensure that older generations receive the support they need, while also having access to programs such as Social Security that provide them with some form of income. Another economic problem that occurs as a population grows older is that retired individuals tend to spend less money. This slows the economy even more in countries with shrinking populations, because their overall consumer base is buying fewer products and spending less money. Without young people to pick up the consumer slack, a country's economy once again begins to shrink. And this is not just a hypothetical situation. In 2016, Heilongjiang Province in northeastern China became the first municipality to run out of money in its pension system. The population in the region had been steadily declining, and more people were retiring than entering the workforce. At the moment, there just aren't enough workers to fund the pension system for the older generation. This might become the norm across the world in countries that rely on workers paying into Social Security and other unsustainable systems that were set up on the premise of an ever-growing workforce. This lack of young laborers causes other problems as well. When there's a shortage of cheap labor, wages tend to increase as the demand for employees increases. This might seem like a good thing at first, but it actually can hurt an economy. As young, unskilled laborers that would normally take entry-level jobs become more scarce, companies begin moving their operations to countries with cheaper labor pools to keep costs low. In parts of the world like Europe and Japan, this is becoming more and more common. But there's a much bigger problem with having a shortage of young people in an economy. It's the younger generations that tend to drive innovation. The fresh minds and dreams of young business people coming out of school and into the workplace are what drive change. Young entrepreneurs disrupt the status quo, which helps economies innovate and grow. However, with graduating classes of skilled students becoming smaller and smaller due to the shrinking populations, the innovators that drive progress are becoming few and far between. There's also a crazy and unexpected phenomenon happening in countries that experience population decline. Depending on who you are, you may or may not agree with how the government is running your country. For younger generations, it feels like it's becoming more and more difficult to make progress, and part of that is due to population decline. In many European countries and even the United States, there are more older voters than young ones. This means that the political majority is in favor of the older, often more conservative voters. This is not because a country as a whole desires to be more conservative, but because older generations that tend to be set in their ways have a larger voter base than younger, more liberal voters. These shifts can have huge ramifications for progressive policies, such as combating climate change, increasing equality, and providing better social services. But the economy and political system are not the only parts of a country affected by population decline. The distribution of where people live can also shift. In most countries, cities continue to grow, even as the population declines. This is because cities tend to have more jobs and opportunities, even when economies are shrinking. As more and more people flock to cities, rural areas become ghost towns. Entire town centers, including schools, shops, and homes, are becoming abandoned as populations decline. Nature slowly takes back these areas, and in some places like Germany, abandoned buildings are torn down and replaced by parks and green spaces. This is definitely a good way to repurpose these areas, but the problem is that people who once lived in these towns and have moved are now putting greater pressure on the infrastructure, housing, and services of major cities. While the country as a whole might experience population decline, cities are seeing more and more growth. This is quite the conundrum, and one problem that desperately needs to be addressed by governments. With more people in urban centers, there's a greater need for investments in public transportation, sanitation, and emergency services. And as a reminder, all of these things tend to be paid for by taxpayers. As the working class becomes smaller, there will be less available income to tax, which will make funding vital services even more difficult than it already is. The sad reality is that in some countries, people are being asked to come out of retirement and work longer. In others, people don't have a choice and must keep working well past the age that they had initially planned to retire just to make ends meet. Germany has raised the retirement age to 67 and has plans to bump it up to 69 in the near future. At this rate, citizens of countries experiencing population decline may be working for their entire lives. So now you're probably wondering where population decline is the highest and how much it will affect you in the future. Eastern Europe contains the majority of countries that are predicted to experience severe population decline in the next 30 years. Several factors affect this region, many having to do with living conditions and political strife after the fall of the Soviet Union. This has led to low birth rates and high emigration rates, a combination that has drastic consequences on a population. Bulgaria is currently expected to lose 22.5% of its overall population by 2050. This means that the country's population will decline by almost a quarter in the next 30 years, from 6.9 million people to 5.4 million. This is a huge drop in population and will have drastic consequences for the country in the future. The largest contributing factor to Bulgaria's population decline is the migration of workers to countries with more job opportunities. The main group of people leaving the country are actually young and middle-aged workers that are so desperately needed to keep Bulgaria's economy from collapsing. The emigration of people from Bulgaria means that not only is its population getting smaller, but that the older generation will make up more of the overall population as the years go by. But Bulgaria isn't the only country experiencing this phenomenon. Latvia is expected to experience a 21.6% decline in population by 2050. This decrease is attributed to low birth rates and the migration of young workers to countries in the European Union with better opportunities. Latvia has been looked at as a clear indicator of what population decline can do to a country's economy. As fewer Latvians are entering the workforce and more citizens are seeking opportunities elsewhere, the Latvian economy has stalled and begun to decline. Again, this is to be expected as there are fewer workers and consumers every year, two things a struggling economy desperately needs to grow. Unfortunately, there are other factors outside the control of a country that can also lead to population decline, such as war. Perhaps there is no better example of this than in Ukraine. Before Putin decided to invade the country and start a war that has raged for what seems like an eternity, Ukraine's population was already in decline. Previous estimates projected that the Ukrainian population would shrink from 43.7 million people to 35.2 by 2050. This was because there were around 9.2 births for every 1,000 people in the country, while the death rate was approximately 15.2 deaths per 1,000. Obviously, this math paints a grim picture. Over 50% more people die each year than are born. This, coupled with migration out of the country for job opportunities, puts Ukraine in a dangerous position. However, with Russia's aggression and the war taking place on Ukrainian soil, the population decline in the country will be worse than anyone could have ever predicted. The obvious cause of the population decline currently happening in Ukraine is death due to combat or collateral damage. The United Nations estimates that somewhere around 14,200 to 14,400 Ukrainians have died in the conflict. At the same time, the decline is exacerbated by people seeking refuge in the surrounding nations to try to escape the carnage. Over 5 million people have fled the borders of Ukraine since the war began, and it's likely more will follow. Some will return home once the war ends, but many will start new lives in a different country. These displaced Ukrainians may visit their former home, but they will probably never move back permanently. This is especially true for anyone who can set up a new life for themselves and their families in the country that they're currently seeking asylum in. The biggest threat to the future of Ukraine's population is that people are not having babies or starting families during this time for obvious reasons. The last thing on anyone's mind during a war is procreating. This means that while the war persists, birth rates will continue to decline. Even after the war ends, there will be a period of time where birth rates continue to decrease sharply until some form of normalcy is returned to the region. When looking at the rate of population decline worldwide, it's clear that Eastern Europe is in a bad spot. However, as can be seen, several other countries outside of Eastern Europe seem to be facing a decrease in population as well. Japan is an economic powerhouse. It has the third highest GDP in the world, behind the United States and China. But Japan faces a huge crisis. Its population is in decline, which is bound to cause an economic shockwave that will rock the island nation. By 2050, Japan's population is predicted to fall by 16.3%. This is due to very low fertility rates at an average of 1.42 births per woman. This is well below the 2.1 births per woman needed to keep a population stable. What this means is that in the coming years, Japan's overall population will be made up of mostly older individuals, with fewer and fewer young workers to take their place and support the economy. As Japan's population and economy shrink, the effects will be felt across the world. Japanese companies will not be able to produce as many products, and innovation will slow down due to a smaller number of young people entering the workforce each year. This will also mean that Japan will consume fewer goods, and therefore their imports will also decrease. Since Japan has such a large GDP, its population decline is not just a problem for the country but for its trade partners as well. Japan exports a massive amount of cars, circuitry, and other types of technology across the world, which will all come to a screeching halt if it doesn't find a way to boost its population. Japan is not the exception either. They just happen to be experiencing population decline at this very moment. Other countries will follow. In fact, many demographers and population scientists agree that the global population will stop increasing around the year 2100. Population growth is already beginning to slow in countries like China, the United States, and most of Europe. It'll not be long until these countries find themselves in the same predicament that Japan is currently facing. This brings us to the simple reason why population decline is happening in certain countries. Yes, a lot of it has to do with low birth rates, but why are birth rates falling in certain nations? The answer is twofold. Firstly, women have greater access to education and therefore more job opportunities. We still have a long way to go on the quest for equality, but strides have been made. Study after study shows that when women have access to education, birth rates decline. There are a few reasons for this. The first is that educated women can pursue careers and therefore put off having children until they've accomplished their goals. When this happens, women tend to wait until they're older to start a family and as a result, have fewer kids. Education for women is not universal around the world, and more often than not, countries that do not provide quality education for their female citizens tend to have higher birth rates. There are definitely other factors that play a role in these statistics, but all evidence points to the fact that the more educational opportunities women have, the less children they have on average. The second factor that's causing a decrease in birth rates is advances in healthcare. There are many more options for people who want to have sex but do not want to have babies than in the past. Contraceptives, birth control are now more widely available than ever before. That being said, not every country provides these services, and where they're in short supply, birth rates tend to be high. This is unsurprising, but brings up an interesting point. As more and more countries advance in healthcare and gain access to family planning resources, birth rates will continue to decrease. Obviously, these advances can be hindered in parts of the world that see contraceptives as being evil, or in regions that don't believe in giving women the right to choose what to do with their own bodies. However, an increase in education and advancement in healthcare are the main factors causing people to start families later in life, and as a result have fewer children. You might be asking yourself, is this a bad thing? Absolutely not, but it does explain why certain countries are experiencing population decline. Take the United States, for example. The US is not losing its population to mass migration. It's seen as the land of opportunity and a melting pot where people from cultures around the world can come together and work in harmony. This is not always what life is actually like in the United States, especially for certain immigrants and disenfranchised people. But there is no doubt that the US has a strong economy and there are opportunities. However, the birth rate in the country is dropping. In recent years, the birth rate has declined from 2 births per woman to 1.7 births per woman. This is below what's necessary to maintain a stable population, which means the United States will experience a population decline in the coming years unless something changes. Within the next decade, population growth will stagnate in the US. At that point, it's only a matter of time before the country's population begins to decline. Economists are now worried that when this happens, there will be a disastrous shortage of young laborers entering the workforce. Also, there will be fewer high school graduates, which could send educational institutions such as colleges and universities crumbling to the ground, as there won't be enough enrollment to keep them all open. However, there is a silver lining. Even though birth rates are declining, many believe the US population will continue to grow steadily. But there's only one way this could happen. Population scientists are banking on the United States allowing more immigrants into the country. As immigration increases, population and the amount of young workers entering the workforce also increases. This is especially true if immigrants are allowed to make the US their home and start their own families within its borders. As a result, increased immigration can offset the low birth rates in the country. That being said, if politicians put roadblocks in place to make immigration more difficult, immigrants will take their skills and families elsewhere. Therefore, it'd be beneficial for everyone in the United States to allow more people into its borders. This will boost the economy and also solve the problem of population decline. Oh, the irony. The bottom line is that birth rates in the United States are on the decline and likely will continue on that trend due to the availability of education for women and relatively easy access to birth control in the country. Therefore, the only way the US can avoid drastic declines in its population and all the problems that go along with it is by welcoming more immigrants into its borders. This is true for any country experiencing population decline that can also provide economic opportunities for immigrants. European countries, Japan, and eventually other countries such as China will need to rethink their immigration policies if they want to continue their economic growth. To make this even more blatantly clear, we can look at South Korea as a case study. Like many countries, South Korea is starting to see its population stagnate and decline. To combat this problem, South Korea invested billions of dollars into programs to encourage its citizens to have more babies. The government increased child allowances and medical subsidies for fertility treatments. They covered buses and subway cars with advertisements to encourage people to start a family. while also installing pink seats on public transportation that are reserved for pregnant women. To show their commitment to the cause, the South Korean government also built hundreds of kindergartens and daycare centers to provide families with the resources they need to have kids while also advancing their careers. All in all, South Korea spent $178 billion over the past 15 years to encourage women to have more children. Even still, the deputy prime minister of the country said there just was not enough progress being made, and South Korea would still begin to experience population decline in the near future. This is a warning for countries that think they can combat population decline without opening their borders to immigrants. It just can't be done. Having a baby is expensive. Having multiple children is even more expensive. This is why many people are moving away from having large families. It's not because they don't want to have multiple kids, it's just that they can't afford it. This fact, coupled with an increase in education and birth control, are the main reasons many countries with strong economies will experience population decline at some point in the next century. For countries that are struggling economically, it's the combination of mass emigration and low birth rates that will drive their populations down. Sometimes people shorten United States of America to just America. But do you know why it's called America? It comes from a navigator and explorer named Amerigo Vespucci. His writings about the journey to the New World were so popular back in Europe that his name became closely associated with the new continent. This is surprising, as Vespucci's stories were written a few years after Columbus thought he landed in Asia. Still, when Americans are taught that Columbus discovered the New World, it's not exactly true. It's unlikely, but there's a theory that an Irish monk named Saint Brendan got there in the 6th century, and that it's certain that Leif Erikson and his band of merry Vikings landed there in the 10th century. There's also the theory that a Muslim Chinese eunuch sailor from the Ming Dynasty arrived there 71 years before Columbus. Country names and their origins are really interesting, as you'll see today when we talk about Europe. Some of these names are certainly surprising and will no doubt leave you scratching your head. Albania. Many civilizations have been in Albania throughout history, including the Greeks and Romans, but the name of the country actually comes from the Albanoi, which was an Illyrian tribe that dated back to the 2nd century BC. Interestingly, their language, Shikip or Shikaip, is thought to have come from the meaning to speak intelligibly. Andorra. Historians aren't too sure where the country name comes from, but one hypothesis that seems about right is it relates to the Arabic phrase Aldura, which means forest. Known for its natural beauty, when the Moors were in Andorra, they named it the place of vast forests. It might have also originated from a word in the local Navarro-Aragonese language. The word Anduril means land of scrubland or brushes. We love this next one. Armenia. The name relates to a guy named Haik, which relates to the country name Hayastan, a nation which he founded in the region where Armenia is today. The story goes that in 2492 BC, Haik defeated a Babylonian king named Bel, and that's when he made his own nation. It goes without saying that this might not have actually happened, but as a wise man once said, if you have to choose between truth and legend, print the legend. His dynasty continued to hold power in the region, and his great-great-great-grandson, a man named Arminak, would become the reason why the country got its name. The name Armenia is derived from this once great leader's dynasty, if you believe the legends, that is. Now for the place where Adolf Hitler was born, Austria. Austria is often high on the best standards of living indexes, coming in at 7th on one particular index for 2022. Still, we bet all those highly educated folks who live there don't know where the country name comes from. It originates from the old High German word Ostarici, which means eastern land. That likely originated from the Latin words Marcia Orientalis, which means eastern borderland. This next one is cool. Azerbaijan. Although this country has been embroiled with conflict recently over the contested region of Nagorno-Karabakh, you shouldn't let that fool you. Azerbaijan is a beautiful country and has an interesting history to match. It seems the name of Azerbaijan originates from a Persian guy named Atropates. He served under Darius III and later Alexander the Great. His name comes from the Greek word Atropatan, which means protected by fire. We sure you heard about this next place, Belarus. The name for this country likely comes from Belaya Rus, the White Rus. The Ruses originally came from Scandinavia, but they settled in large parts of Russia and nearby countries. There were the Black Rus and the White Rus, two political entities which controlled large parts of Eastern Europe during the days of the Rus migration. These days you might order a drink, either a White Russian or a Black Russian, and there's history in that drink. This one's interesting too. Belgium. Belgium's 11.5 million people sit between the Netherlands, Germany, Luxembourg, and France. Many of those folks might also be polyglots, speaking Flemish, French, German, and possibly English. Their country name comes from Belgica. This was the Roman name for the place where the hard-hitting tribes of the northern part of Gaul gave Julius Caesar a run for his money. Bosnia and Herzegovina. You might remember that until about 30 years ago, there was a place called Yugoslavia in Central and Southeast Europe. It contained the 6 republics of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and Slovenia. There are about 3.5 million people living in Bosnia and Herzegovina today. It's called that because of the river of Bosna, but the Herzegovina part is a little more interesting. It comes from the word Hersek, an old word meaning duke. It seems that a guy named Stjepan Vučić-Kosasa claimed this area for himself in the 1400s and named it the property of the duke. Bulgaria. This country name is easy enough to figure out. It's said to be related to the Bulgars. These were a tribe of people with Turkic roots that founded the First Bulgarian Empire. The word Bulgar relates to rebels, disturbers, and generally folks that like to shake things up. Croatia. This name comes from the word Croat, who were a Slavic people with a rich history that we won't go into because it would take us all week. Cyprus. Cyprus is an island nation in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, so every July and August you can expect there to be great hordes of pink-skinned Brits getting a bit of that thing that's often strange to them, sunshine. Back in the ancient times, the Greeks called it a number of things, including a golden leaf thrown into the sea and a place of wild weather and volcanoes. Their name for it was Kypros, which seems to be related to all the precious copper there. Czech Republic. This country's name may come from a Slavic tribe called the Česi, and it might also originate from the word Zeta, which were a band of warriors. As you know, it used to be part of Czechoslovakia, and before that it was called Bohemia. And that word comes from the Latin Boiohemum, meaning Gallic tribe. It gets more complicated though. The word Czech is also related to 3 Slavic warrior brothers named Lech, Czech, and Rus, who settled various areas for themselves. Denmark. The name Denmark could have come from the legendary King Dan. It might also come from the Latin and Greek name Dania. It also could have come from words meaning flat lands, but it might also have emerged from very old texts in which historians talked about the Dani people. Estonia. Estonia is so tricky that no one knows the answer. It's likely the word comes from isti, which might have come from the word esti. This is what the Roman historian Tacitus called a bunch of Eastern tribal folks when he was writing in the history text called Germania. Finland. This should be easy. It's the land of the Finns. But who are Finns? This is especially confusing when you hear that the early Finnish language didn't even have an F sound. Some historians say the word Finn comes from an Old English word Finna, but it's more likely that it comes from the Swedish words Finlonti and Finlandia, which just designated the area where Finland is. But then the Finns might say their country is Suomi, the name given to the northern regions of Finland. That's a word that may come from the word Suoma, which means swampland. If this isn't confusing enough, the word might be related to fish skins, which were apparently something people wore on their bodies. France. This is easy. It comes from the Franks, a Germanic tribe, and that comes from the old German word Franka, which can mean both fierce and brave. Georgia. Joseph Stalin's country of birth likely gets its name from the Persian word Guruj. The Guruj people came head-to-head with the Western European Crusaders, and unsurprisingly, the Europeans changed the name of the region. They called it Georgia, and then lied and said it was related to St. George. But there's another theory that it originated in ancient Greek texts, when the writers were referencing to tillers of the land, the Georgi. It might have also come from another Persian word, land of the wolves. Now for Europe's biggest country in terms of economy, Germany. Germany got its name from the Romans and Julius Caesar, who named this place at the east of the Rhine, Germania. Greece. The ancient Greeks didn't call themselves Greeks. They lived in city-states, although they might have called themselves Hellenes. In Greek mythology, the Hellenes came from Hellen, the son of Deucalion and Pyrrha. The Romans started calling them Greeks when they referred to these people as Graeci. Hungary. The name comes from on-ogur. This meant 10 arrows, which could have been related to the 10 tribes that belonged to the Magyar Confederation. The Magyars were tribes that didn't much like staying near the Ural Mountains, so they settled in other places, including what we now call Hungary. You'll dig this next one, Iceland. There are a lot of names for Iceland that all relate back to old poems. There's a story that in the 9th century a Viking looked at the place and decided to call it Snaeland, the land of snow. There's another tale that said the reason locals back then named it Iceland and the other place Greenland was so that raiders would think there was nothing worth raiding in Iceland. Yet another tale says a Norwegian guy named Hafna Floki Vigoreshnan tried to live in Iceland, but things didn't exactly turn out great. All his livestock died during the first winter. He then got up and left, looking back over his shoulder and thinking, God, it's just full of ice. He then named it Iceland. Ireland. Maybe the name Ireland comes from the land of angry people. Get it? Ire means a form of anger. It has nothing to do with the word ire, though. The most likely explanation is it comes from the word ira, which in turn comes from the word Iru. This is a really old word that relates to the matron goddess of Ireland. She was Iru. The ancient Greeks called Ireland Lerna, and the Romans called it Hibernia, Italy. Back in the day, there wasn't such a thing as Italy, but there were tribes in the area called Sicels. The Greeks called these folks Italoi, and that's likely where we get the name Italy. Kazakhstan. As you know, a few countries end with the suffix stan. What's that all about? The answer is it comes from the Persian and Urdu word that means place of. So Kazakhstan is the place of the Kazakhs. But who were the Kazakhs? The word likely comes from Kaz, which means to wander. This area, after all, was full of nomadic people. Other meanings of the word might refer to the riders of the steppe. Either way, that's pretty cool. Kosovo. This one is short and sweet, or at least there doesn't seem to be many different theories out there. The name comes from the Serbian word that means field of the blackbirds. Latvia. This country's name comes from a group of tribal people called the Latgalians. They later joined up with other tribal folks, and together they made up the Latvians. Liechtenstein. If you take this word apart, it can mean bright and stone. That was the name of a castle, and the castle became the name of a ruling dynasty, and that's how we get the country of Liechtenstein. Lithuania. Scholars might find themselves in a punch-up over the origin of this country's name. There's no consensus, but it might come from a small river called the Litava. There are other theories, such as it coming out of the word for rain. Luxembourg. This one's a bit easier. Back in 963, a guy named Siegfried Count d'Ardennes swapped his land for a Roman castle that was located on the Alzette River. The castle was called Lucilienburghoek, meaning little fortress. It was this castle that became the origin of the name Luxembourg. This next one is rather funny. Macedonia. Macedonia is thought to have come from the Greek word makednos, which can mean tall. It has the same root as the Greek word makros, which can mean high or long. So in short, when the Greeks referred to Macedonia, they might have been talking about highlanders or a place where tall folks lived. This next one is also quite amusing. Moldova. Moldova simply takes its name from the Moldova River. According to legend, in the 14th century, a guy named Prince Drago was hunting out there. Things did not go as planned. His dog, named Molda, drowned in the river. After that, the prince named the river after his much-loved pooch. So Moldova takes its name from a rather daft dog. Sorry, Moldovans. Monaco. This land of millionaires and tax evaders gets its name from the Greek word monikos, which means single, mono, and house, kos. Legend has it that Hercules stopped off there, and because of that, one single temple was built. Montenegro. We guess you can already figure out what this next country was named after. By breaking down the two words in its name, we get Black Mountain. The reason the country was called this was down to Mount Lovchen looking black when it was densely covered in trees. Netherlands. In Old English, Holland meant woodland, and that's how the folks of the western region of the Netherlands were referred to. After a while, people from all around this region were said to have come from Holland. It's even more confusing when you think of the people, the Dutch people. The word Dutch actually comes from the Old English words Thiod and Theod. The words Netherlands also comes from the word for lowland areas, literally the lowlands. The region has a complicated history, but don't worry about using either Netherlands or Holland. They pretty much mean the same thing, even if they aren't exactly the same. We like this next one too. Norway. The word Norway means pretty much one thing. That is the way north, or the northern way. It comes from the Old English word Northway. It's self-explanatory given that Norway is indeed the way north. Poland. Once upon a time, there was a Slavic tribe named the Polans. These people got to work building what became the state of Poland. But then you also have the Polish word for Poland, which is Polska. That literally means the land of fields. Also, you might know the legend of those three butt-kicking brothers, Czech, Lech, and Rush. Lech was the brother that built Lechia, which is another ancient name for Poland. This next one is kinda crazy. Portugal. Portugal comes from the Roman Celtic name Portus Cale, meaning port of Cale. Who's Cale? Good question. She was a deity in Celtic mythology, sometimes referred to as a divine hag. Hey, don't shoot the messenger, hags were a big deal in Celtic mythology, so Portugal was named after an old hag. In the 7th century, Portugal started being called Portugal. Romania. You won't be surprised to hear that Romania takes its name from the Romans. Some Romans went there back in the day and settled the region, mixing in with the local Dacians, a tribe which Rome fought to get this region under its control. One historian explained, those Romans who remained in Dacia mixed their Roman language with the language of the Sarmatians, of the Slavs, and that of the Dacians. Russia. You already know the story of the Rus. Russia was the land of the Rus. These folks were Norse merchants that traveled across the Baltic Sea and ended up settling in the region near Moscow. San Marino. We imagine some of you haven't even heard of San Marino, the tiny and beautiful country in southern Europe that always gets its butt kicked when it plays soccer with other nations. As the story goes, a guy named St. Marinus escaped to this area thinking the Roman emperor was going to nail him up by his wrists. The saint ran for his life, built a church, kept speaking about God and Jesus, and hey presto, in time we got San Marino. Serbia. Serbia gets its name from the Serbs, like the Croats. The Serbs are a Slavic people. They have lots in common, just as the New York Times wrote in an article saying historians contend that the Serbs and Croats were related tribes of Persian origin who migrated as warriors to the Balkan Peninsula, where they were assimilated by South Slavs already there by the 5th century. So Serbia was just the land of the Serbs. Slovakia. Slovakia is the land of the Slovaks. But the word Slovak isn't that different from the words Slovenes, Slavonians, and Slavs. Some Slavic tribes settled in what is present-day Slovakia sometime in the 5th century. Many centuries after, it became part of Czechoslovakia, along with Ukraine and the Czech Republic, but now it's its own place. Slovenia. So, as you can guess, Slovenia also relates to Slavic people. Slovenia and Slovakia don't border each other, and of course they have their own unique traditions, but they are similar in many ways too, just like the Welsh and the Scottish share lots of similarities. A Slav might be a Slav, but all Slavs are unique, and all Slavic countries are home to different kinds of Slav culture. Spain. The Romans called Spain Hispania. The Greeks talked about some folks who lived in the Iberian Peninsula and had their own language. There's a theory that the word for Spain might have come from the lands where metals are forged. It might have also come from the Greek word Hespernia, which means western land. Sweden. Sweden was once occupied by the feared Svea tribe. It was the land of the Svea, and Svea, like many of the tribes of Scandinavia, took off in boats and caused mayhem during raids. As you know, these guys we call the Vikings, thus popularizing their tribe's name, giving us the name of Sweden. Switzerland. The land of the Swiss is Switzerland, but who are the Swiss? It comes from the word Schwyz, which was the name of a province in this area. In 1291, 3 provinces called cantons, which included Schwyz, Uri, and Unterwalden, joined together. They became the Ewigerbund, the Eternal League. This became Switzerland. Turkey. This region of the world wasn't the country of Turkey until 1923. The word Turkey comes from the Turkic people, even though Turkey or areas of Turkey have been called all kinds of things over the centuries. This next one always seems to confuse Americans. United Kingdom. The Romans called this place Britannia, which at the time of their arrival was full of tribal groups including the Celts. In the 10th century, England was formed when a bunch of West Saxon kings wanted to consolidate power. The Vikings and the Saxons had been having numerous bloody scraps for ages by then. Under the laws in Wales Act of 1535 and 1542, England annexed Wales, and then in 1707 the Scots got on board, and the Kingdom of Great Britain became a thing. Northern Ireland is now also part of the United Kingdom. These countries all are still their own nations, even if they do form the country of the United Kingdom. In geographic terms, all of Ireland is part of the British Isles, but this is just an area, nothing to do with politics. There are tons of little islands in the British Isles. England, Scotland, and Wales and their little islands are part of Great Britain, but none of Ireland is. That means the UK and Great Britain are not exactly the same, but they're close. In terms of words, the Greeks and Romans might call England Albion, which comes from Latin and refers to the White Land. When someone sailed over to England, they were often met by the White Cliffs of Dover. The Romans called Scotland Caledonia after the Caledoni tribe. They also called Wales Cambria. The word England comes from the land of Angles, which comes from the Old English word Anglaland. Before that, the Romans might have referred to it as Angli. Vatican City. The word Vatican comes from an Etruscan settlement that went by the name Vatica. or Vaticum. The Etruscan civilization goes back about to 900 BC. They had their own things going on, but when Rome became super powerful, the Etruscans just became a part of Roman society. The Romans used the word Ager Vaticanus, which means Vatican territory, and that's how Vatican City got its name. Now you need to watch European stereotypes, or have a look at this.